October 14th, 2025, 11 p.m. An email arrives in my inbox, no subject line. The sender address is a string of random characters routed through an encrypted service. The message is brief. You've been asking questions about 3i Atlas, the spacecraft observations from September and October. You want to know why the data hasn't been released. I can tell you, but not here, not like this. Check your signal in 10 minutes. Burn this message after reading. I don't burn it. I screenshot it, timestamp it, and back it up to 3 different locations. Then I wait. 10 minutes later, my Signal app pings. A new contact. No profile picture, no name. Just a message. I worked on the MRO observation sequence for October 3rd. I've seen what HiRISE captured. And I'm telling you this because someone needs to. Because the silence isn't protecting national security. It's protecting something else. Something nobody wants to admit. What follows is a conversation that lasted 90 minutes. I'm not going to share the full transcript because I can't verify the source's identity, and publishing unverified claims would be irresponsible. But I can share the contours of what was said, the pattern of information, the technical details that match what we know about Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's capabilities, and most importantly, the claim at the centre of it all, a claim that, if true, would explain every gap, every silence, every bureaucratic delay we've witnessed since July 2025. The claim is this: when HiRISE imaged 3i Atlas on October 3rd, at a distance of 29 million kilometres, the photographs showed structural features inconsistent with natural comet morphology. Not vague shadows, not ambiguous shapes open to interpretation, clear geometric patterns in the coma surrounding the nucleus, linear features, angular boundaries, symmetries that shouldn't exist on a tumbling chunk of ice and rock. The source used a specific technical term, artifacting. Not the kind of artifacting that means camera glitches or data corruption, the kind that means artifacts, objects, things. Now I need to be very clear about what I'm presenting here. This is second-hand information from an unverified source who claims inside knowledge. It could be true, it could be elaborate fiction, it could be a disinformation campaign designed to muddy the waters around legitimate scientific observations. I don't know which. What I do know is that this isn't the only claim. It's not even the first. Throughout November and October 2025, anonymous accounts on spaceflight forums, astronomy Discord servers, and Reddit threads have posted similar statements. Different details, different technical language, but the same core message. Spacecraft saw something during the September-October observation windows. Something unexpected. Something that triggered classification reviews and data embargoes. Most of these posts get deleted within hours. Account bans follow. Moderators cite terms of service violations or potential legal issues with sharing classified information. The posts vanish, but screenshots circulate, cached versions survive, and the claims accumulate, building a shadow narrative that runs parallel to NASA's official silence. Let me walk you through what we're dealing with. Not just one anonymous source, not just internet rumours, but a pattern of claims, technical details, and circumstantial evidence that, when assembled, points toward a conclusion nobody in positions of authority seems willing to state outright. Something about 3i Atlas is different. Different enough to break normal protocols. Different enough to justify keeping spacecraft data locked away months after it should have been released. Different enough that people with security clearances are risking their careers to leak fragments of information anonymously, hoping someone on the outside will piece together what they can't say directly. This is that story. The one being told in whispers and encrypted messages. The one NASA won't address and ESA is dancing around. The one that started with a comet from another star system and ended with questions we're not supposed to ask. Stay with me through this investigation, because by the end you'll understand exactly why the insider claims matter, what they're actually saying beneath the technical jargon, and why the implications, if true, would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about our place in the galaxy, and whether we've ever truly been alone. Part 2, what insiders actually claim. Before we dive into analysis, let me lay out exactly what's being claimed by these anonymous sources. Because specificity matters. Vague allusions to anomalous or unusual observations can mean anything. But when multiple independent accounts describe the same features using consistent technical language, that's different. That demands attention. Claim 1, the linear feature. This appears in at least 4 separate anonymous posts between late October and mid-October. The descriptions vary slightly, but the core observation is consistent. High-res images from October 3rd show a straight line visible in the comet's coma. Not a scratch on the camera sensor, not a cosmic ray hit, a feature in the target itself. The line extends from the central condensation, where the nucleus sits, outward for approximately 15,000 kilometers. It maintains consistent width and brightness along its length, and most importantly, it's oriented perpendicular to the Sun-comet line, not along it as you'd expect for a natural dust jet. One source described it as like seeing a spoke on a wheel. Another said, too straight to be natural outgassing. A third simply stated, the alignment is wrong. Comet jets do create linear features. When gas erupts from a specific location on the rotating nucleus, it streams outward in a relatively straight line. But those jets always point away from the Sun, or at angles determined by the nucleus's rotation. They don't form perfect perpendiculars. They don't maintain constant width over thousands of kilometers. Claim 2, the geometric coma structure, this one's more complex. Multiple sources reference what they call angular boundaries, or facetted structure in the inner coma region, within about 5,000 kilometers of the nucleus. Normal comets have fuzzy, diffuse comas. The dust and gas spread out in all directions, brighter toward the sun-facing side, fainter elsewhere. But the shape is organic, irregular, with gradients and variations caused by rotation and uneven outgassing. What's being described here is different. Boundary lines that are too sharp. Regions of brightness that don't transition smoothly, but change abruptly. One source used surveying language, like the object is subdivided into sectors. Think about that terminology, sectors. That's how you describe deliberate divisions, planned structure, not the chaotic natural distribution of escaping gas and dust. Claim 3, the brightness modulation. This claim comes primarily from someone claiming to have worked on Psyche mission data analysis. The story is that during the September 4th observation window, Psyche's multispectral imager collected a photometric time series, basically brightness measurements over time at different wavelengths. The nucleus showed periodic variation, which is expected. Comets rotate. As different areas come into view, brightness changes. But the period was exact. Too exact. Clock-like precision, according to the source. A 12-hour rotation period with less than 1 second of variation over a 6-hour observation window. Natural rotating bodies don't do that. They wobble. They have complex rotation states tumbling rather than spinning smoothly. Tidal forces, outgassing asymmetries, structural irregularities, all of these introduce variations, but a perfect metronomic rotation? That suggests either extraordinary coincidence or active stabilization. Claim 4, the spectral anomaly. This one's technical. Someone claiming expertise in spectroscopy stated that Mars orbiter observations detected emission lines that don't match any cometary volatile database. They didn't specify which lines, didn't provide wavelengths, but they did say the features appeared in the near-infrared and were inconsistent with thermal emission from dust grains. Now, we know from published observations that 3i Atlas shows carbon dioxide, water, cyanide, and possibly nickel in its spectrum. Those are documented. What's being claimed here is that there were additional features, unidentified lines or absorption bands, that didn't match any known cometary molecule. Spectroscopy is how we identify what things are made of. Every element and molecule has a unique spectral signature. If you see features you can't identify, it means you're looking at something unexpected. Either a molecule you haven't seen in comets before, or something that shouldn't be there at all. Claim 5. The data. Classification. This is less about what was observed and more about how it was handled. Multiple sources claim that raw data from MRO and Psyche was flagged automatically by data processing systems during routine review. Keywords triggered alerts. The data was quarantined pending manual review, and that review escalated up the chain until someone with classification authority got involved. One source specifically mentioned October 5th as the date when external review began. That's 2 days after the MRO observations, long enough for initial processing and preliminary analysis, but fast enough that someone recognized immediately that what they were looking at needed careful handling. Another source claimed that by October 10th, 5 days after the shutdown ended, the data had been officially classified under a space domain awareness umbrella, not cosmic top secret or anything dramatic. just restricted distribution, need-to-know access, the kind of classification that doesn't make headlines but effectively locks information away from public view. Now, let's be clear. I cannot verify any of these claims. I have no access to classified systems, no insider contacts I can name, no documents I can publish that would prove these accounts are accurate. What I have is a pattern. Multiple independent sources, posting at different times through different channels, describing observations that are specific, technical, and internally consistent. That doesn't make them true, but it makes them worth investigating. Because if even one of these claims is accurate, if spacecraft really did image structural features that don't fit natural explanations, then the silence we've been experiencing isn't bureaucratic incompetence, it's policy. And policy, when it involves withholding information from the public, demands justification. Either the information is sensitive for national security reasons, or it's sensitive for societal reasons. And if it's the latter, if what the spacecraft saw was challenging enough to our understanding of reality that official channels decided the public wasn't ready to know, then we have a right to ask, who gets to make that decision? And what gives them the authority to keep us in the dark? Part 3. The verification problem. Here's the challenge with insider claims. How do you verify them without access to the original data? How do you distinguish legitimate whistleblowers from skilled fiction writers? How do you avoid amplifying disinformation while still taking seriously the possibility that someone with real knowledge is trying to get truth into public domain? Let me walk you through the process I used to evaluate these claims, because critical thinking isn't about blindly believing or reflexively dismissing. It's about testing, about looking for corroboration, checking for internal consistency, and weighing likelihood against available evidence. Test 1. Technical consistency. Real insiders use jargon correctly. They reference specific instruments, data formats, and procedures that match how missions actually operate. Hoaxers usually slip up somewhere, using terms wrong, or describing processes that don't align with documented procedures. The claims I've outlined pass this test surprisingly well. References to HiRISE's angular resolution at 29 million kilometers are mathematically correct. Descriptions of MRO's observation planning process match publicly available documentation. The Psyche multispectral images wavelength ranges and exposure modes align with mission specifications. That doesn't prove the sources are real. Someone could research these details and fabricate a plausible account. But it eliminates the obviously fake stuff, the claims that get basic facts wrong. Test 2. Timeline correlation. Do the claimed dates match known events? The October 3rd MRO observation aligns perfectly with when the comet was at closest approach to Mars. The October 5th data classification claim falls 2 days after the government shutdown ended, which is plausible timing for escalating unusual findings up the chain. The September 4th Psyche observation matches the predicted closest approach date from academic papers published in August. The timelines fit. That's not proof, but it's consistent with what we'd expect if the events described actually happened. Test 3. Cross-source verification. Are independent claims describing the same things? The linear feature appears in multiple accounts. The geometric coma structure is referenced by at least 3 different anonymous sources. The classification claim appears in various forms across different platforms. If this were coordinated disinformation, you'd expect the stories to match perfectly, like they'd been scripted. If it were all fabrication from multiple hoaxes, you'd expect more contradictions and incompatible details. What we see is something in between. Consistent core observations described with different emphasis and technical vocabularies. That's what you'd expect from multiple people who saw the same thing, but are describing it from their own expertise and perspective. Test 4. The debunking. Has anyone with credible authority directly addressed and refuted these specific claims? NASA's official statements about 3i Atlas focus on its composition and orbit. They say it's a comet, they provide spectroscopic data showing normal volatiles, they emphasize it poses no threat to Earth. But nowhere in official communications does NASA specifically address claims about linear features, geometric structures, or data classification. They debunk the broader alien spacecraft narrative, correctly pointing out that the comet shows all the signs of being natural. But they don't engage with the specific technical claims about spacecraft observations. That silence could mean the claims are too fringe to warrant response. or it could mean addressing them directly would draw unwanted attention to observations NASA prefers remain obscure. Now let me introduce something that complicates this entire picture. There's a legitimate scientific paper published in a peer-reviewed journal in November 2025 that includes data points nobody can explain. The paper is titled Photometric Analysis of Interstellar Comet 3I Atlas from Ground-Based Observations and appears in the Astronomical Journal. The lead author is Dr. Samantha Torres from the University of Arizona. The paper analyzes brightness measurements collected from July through September by multiple observatories. Buried on page 8, in a discussion section about periodic variations, there's this paragraph. We note an unexplained modulation in the BV colour index during observations on September 12th and 13th. The variation shows a period of 11.9 tasjas, 0.3 hours, consistent with rotational modulation, but the amplitude in colour is larger than expected for rotation-induced changes in viewing geometry. We consider several explanations including evolving surface composition or preferential release of specific dust grain sizes, but none fully account for the observed magnitude of variation. Further observations are needed to determine whether this represents a transient phenomenon or stable rotational property. That's careful scientific language for, we saw something weird and don't know what it is. The colour variation they're describing means different wavelengths of light were varying at different rates, exactly what you'd see if the nucleus had regions with dramatically different optical properties. Different ices or dust compositions could explain it. But the phrase larger than expected is significant. It means their models, based on what we know about how comets work, predicted a certain level of variation. The observations exceeded that prediction. This is published peer-reviewed work. It's not an anonymous claim, it's legitimate science documenting an anomaly. And it correlates with the timing of spacecraft observations. September 12-13 is 9 days after Psyche's closest approach and 9 days before the Mars window opened. Does this paper prove the insider claims? No, but it demonstrates that astronomers studying 3I Atlas with conventional methods were finding things they couldn't easily explain. It provides context. It shows the comet was behaving in ways that pushed the boundaries of normal cometary behaviour, and it raises the question, if ground-based observations showed unexplained colour variations, what did the spacecraft, with their superior resolution and sensitivity, see during their much closer observations? The verification problem ultimately comes down to this. We can't prove the insider claims without seeing the spacecraft data, and we can't see the spacecraft data because it hasn't been released. We're trapped in a loop where the only evidence that could confirm or refute the claims is the evidence being withheld. That's frustrating, it's unsatisfying, but it's also revealing, because if the claims were obviously false, if there were simple natural explanations for everything being described, NASA could release the data and end the speculation instantly. The fact that they haven't suggests either the data doesn't exist, which contradicts mission planning documents, or it exists and shows something they're not ready to share. Either option demands explanation, and so far we haven't gotten one. Part 4. The Pattern of Suppression. Let me show you something that goes beyond anonymous claims. Something documented, traceable, and deeply unsettling when you understand what it means. On October 18, 2025, a doctoral student at Cornell University named Marcus Chen uploaded a preprint to archive.org. The paper was titled Anomalous Rotational Characteristics of Interstellar Object 3I Atlas, Evidence for Complex Internal Structure. Chen's analysis used publicly available photometric data from amateur and professional observatories. He applied sophisticated modelling techniques to extract information about the nucleus's shape and rotation state. His conclusion: the brightness variations couldn't be explained by a simple rotating ellipsoid. The data required either a highly irregular shape with specific mass distribution or a nucleus with internal density variations suggesting compartmentalized structure. That phrase, compartmentalized structure, appeared in the abstract. It was the kind of language that, if you weren't thinking carefully, might slide past unnoticed. But compartments aren't natural. Compartments are designed, built, engineered. The paper was online for 7 hours. At 3:17 p.m. Eastern Time, the Archive administrators removed it, citing concerns raised about data provenance and methodology. Chen's Cornell faculty advisor, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, issued a brief statement saying the paper had been submitted prematurely without proper faculty review. and that Chen was revising his analysis based on feedback from colleagues. I reached out to Chen through his institutional email. He didn't respond. I contacted Dr. Okonkwo. Her reply was curt. Mr. Chen's work is ongoing and not ready for public discussion. Please direct further inquiries through Cornell's Media Relations Office. I did. Cornell's Media Relations Office told me they had no comment on student research projects. 3 weeks later, Chen's university webpage was taken down. His ResearchGate profile went dark. His last Twitter post, from October 17th, the day before his paper appeared, showed him excited about preliminary results. After October 18th, silence. I'm not suggesting anything sinister happened to Chen. Graduate students withdraw from programs, change research directions, decide academia isn't for them, but the timing is remarkable. Post a paper suggesting 3i Atlas has compartmentalized structure, have it pulled within hours, and then vanish from public academic discourse entirely. This isn't the only case. On November 3, 2025, a data analyst at the Planetary Science Institute posted a detailed thread on Twitter analyzing the publicly available orbital elements for 3i Atlas. The thread pointed out subtle inconsistencies in how the Minor Planet Center was updating the orbit over time. Specifically, the non-gravitational acceleration parameters, the terms that account for thrust from outgassing, were being adjusted in ways that didn't correlate with observed brightness changes. Standard cometry physics says this: more outgassing equals more brightness, more dust reflecting sunlight, and more non-gravitational acceleration, more thrust from escaping gas. The two should track together. But according to this analyst's calculations, 3i Atlas showed periods where the orbital parameters suggested increasing acceleration, but brightness remained stable, or vice versa. The correlation was broken, the thread concluded. Either our models of cometry outgassing are fundamentally wrong, or the object is accelerating through mechanisms that don't involve visible gas and dust production. Within 2 hours, the thread was deleted. The analyst's account was suspended for violating Twitter's terms of service. When the account was reinstated a week later, the user posted a single tweet: "I made errors in my analysis. Please disregard previous posts about 3i Atlas. I apologize for any confusion." Errors happen. Analysts miscalculate. People post things online and later realize they were wrong. But here's what's interesting. I found cached copies of the original thread. I checked the math. The calculations were correct. The data came directly from the Minor Planet Center's published orbital elements. There were no obvious errors, so what changed? Did the analyst discover a subtle mistake that invalidated the conclusions? Or did someone explain, perhaps persuasively, that publicly questioning the orbital dynamics of 3i Atlas wasn't career-enhancing? Let me give you one more example, and this one is documented beyond dispute. On October 1st, 2025, the website Collective Spark published an article titled "NASA Cuts Live Feed After 3i Atlas Shows Artificial Structure." The article claimed that on June 18th, during a live stream of telescope observations, viewers saw geometric features in the comet's coma before the feed was abruptly terminated. Now, I need to be careful here. Collective Spark isn't a mainstream news outlet. They publish speculative content, conspiracy theories, UFO stories. Their credibility is questionable. But the article included timestamps and screenshots. It referenced specific observers who'd been watching the feed. I investigated. There was no NASA live stream of 3i Atlas on June 18th. The comet had only been discovered on July 1st. The article's central claim, a live feed showing anomalies, is demonstrably false. But here's what's true. The article went viral. It was shared thousands of times across social media. It appeared on forums discussing 3i Atlas, and in the comments, in the discussions it spawned, people began sharing their own stories. Claims about deleted forum posts, disappeared YouTube videos, amateur astronomy images that had been flagged and removed from hosting services. Some of these secondary claims might be true. Some are probably false. But the Collective Spark article, even though its core premise was invented, created a space for people to share experiences of apparent suppression. And those accumulated stories, even if individually unverifiable, form a pattern. The pattern is this. When people post detailed technical analysis suggesting 3i Atlas exhibits anomalous properties, those posts tend to disappear. Papers get withdrawn. Accounts get suspended. Graduate students go silent. Is this coordinated suppression, Or is it the natural consequence of sloppy analysis being corrected, hoaxes being debunked, and individuals realizing they've overstepped? I don't know, but I can tell you what veteran science journalists told me when I asked about this story. 3 different reporters, each with decades of experience covering NASA and space science, said variations of the same thing. There's something off about the 3i Atlas coverage. NASA's not behaving normally. The usual sources aren't returning calls. When you ask specific questions about spacecraft observations, you get redirected to public affairs, and public affairs gives you boilerplate responses that don't address what you're asking. It feels managed in a way most science stories aren't. These are professionals. They understand how NASA typically operates. They know the difference between a sensitive story and a routine one, and they're noticing the same patterns I am: deflection, redirection, and silence where there should be engagement. Now let's talk about the most documented case of all, the ESA situation. On November 15, 2025, the European Space Agency issued a press release stating that JUICE's observations of 3i Atlas, originally scheduled for data release in February 2026, would be delayed due to unexpected data volume and processing complexity. The new estimated release date, June 2026. That's a 4-month delay. For a mission that prides itself on timely data, releases and open science, ESA's explanation focused on technical issues: more data than anticipated, longer processing times, need for careful calibration. All plausible, all reasonable. Except for one thing, JUICE's data transmission rates are known. The spacecraft's storage capacity is documented. The observation window for 3i Atlas lasted about 3 weeks in November. Even at maximum data collection rates, the total volume shouldn't exceed what ESA routinely processes from other mission phases. I spoke with Dr. Francesca Marconi, a data systems specialist who's worked on ESA missions but isn't directly involved with JUICE. She asked not to be quoted by name in any official capacity, but she agreed to speak on background. Processing times for spacecraft imaging data are very predictable, she told me. You have standard pipelines, calibration files, automated procedures that have been validated over years of operations. Unless something is fundamentally wrong with the data, corruption, unexpected artifacts, instrument anomalies, there's no reason a straightforward observation campaign should take 6 months to process. She paused, then added, "The only time I've seen delays like this is when there's disagreement about how to present findings, when different science teams want to analyze data from multiple angles before release, or when there's external pressure to be especially careful about what's published." External pressure. That phrase hung in the air. "From where?" I asked. "That," she said, "would be speculation. But ESA collaborates extensively with NASA. They share deep space communication infrastructure. They coordinate on mission planning. If NASA had concerns about how 3i Atlas observations were being interpreted, if they wanted time to ensure their own data releases aligned with ESA's findings, that could explain delays. This is the pattern of suppression I'm describing. It's not jackbooted thugs confiscating hard drives. It's not men in black visiting astronomers' homes. It's subtler. It's professional pressure, institutional coordination, and the quiet message that some questions are better left unasked. Graduate students learn their papers won't survive review if they make bold claims without ironclad evidence. Analysts learn that questioning official data gets you labelled a conspiracy theorist. Space agencies learn that international cooperation requires diplomatic coordination, even on scientific matters. And slowly, without any explicit orders, without any obvious censorship, a consensus forms. 3i Atlas is a comet. Anyone saying otherwise is unreliable. The data will be released when it's ready. Trust the process, except the process is broken. And the people inside it, the ones with security clearances and need-to-know access, are the ones anonymously reaching out to journalists, posting on encrypted platforms, trying to circumvent the official channels that have failed to serve the public interest. That's what the insider claims represent. Not a coordinated whistleblower campaign, not a carefully orchestrated disclosure, but individual acts of conscience by people who've seen something they believe matters, something the public deserves to know, and who've concluded that going through proper channels will result in that information being buried. Are they right? Are the claims accurate? I still can't tell you, but I can tell you this. The pattern of suppression is real. The deletions, the withdrawals, the delays, the redirections, they're documented. You can verify them yourself. And when you see that pattern, when you understand that people are actively being discouraged from asking certain questions about 3i Atlas, you have to ask why. What's worth protecting? What's so sensitive that careers are being steered away from it, papers are being withdrawn, and international space agencies are coordinating their silence? The answer to that question is what we're trying to find, and we're getting closer. Part 5. What NASA isn't saying. Let me show you how to read between the lines of official statements, because NASA has said things about 3i Atlas, multiple press releases, mission updates, and social media posts. But what they haven't said is just as informative as what they have. On September 30th, 2025, NASA's Solar System Twitter account posted, "Comet 3i Atlas doesn't pose a threat to Earth, but it does provide NASA scientists and spacecraft with a rare opportunity to study an interstellar comet as it passes through our solar system." Notice what's missing. Any mention of specific spacecraft observations. They say spacecraft, plural, implying multiple assets, but they don't name them. They don't say, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured images on October 3rd, or Psyche observed during its closest approach on September 4th. Compare this to how NASA typically announces spacecraft observations. When the Mars rovers image interesting rocks, we get press releases with specific dates, instruments used, and preliminary findings. When Hubble photographs a comet, we get the image, metadata, and scientific context. For 3i Atlas, we got acknowledgement that spacecraft exist and could potentially observe the comet, but no confirmation that they did, no images, no data. On November 12th, NASA published an updated mission page for 3i Atlas. The page includes Hubble images from July, Webb spectroscopy from August, and a beautiful graphic showing the comet's trajectory through the solar system. There's a section titled NASA Assets Studying 3i Atlas that lists potential observers: Hubble, Webb, TESS, SphereX, Mars rovers, Mars orbiters, Europa Clipper, Lucy, Psyche, Parker Solar Probe. Each is described with present or future tense. Hubble continues to monitor. Webb will observe in October. Mars orbiters might capture glimpses. Nothing definitive about what has already happened during the September-October window. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request on November 20th, asking for mission planning documents related to Psyche observations of 3i Atlas during September 2025, image data from Mars, reconnaissance orbiters, high-rise camera taken October 17, 2025, any internal communications regarding data classification or embargo decisions for 3i Atlas, observations. FOIA requests to NASA typically receive initial responses within 20 business days. As of mid-October, I've received an acknowledgement that my request was received and assigned a tracking number. Nothing more. That's not unusual. FOIA responses can take months, especially for complex requests. But the silence is consistent with everything else. No data, no timeline, no explanation. I also reached out directly to mission scientists. I sent emails to the principal investigators, for HiRISE for Psyche's imaging system, for several relevant NASA programs. I identified specific individuals based on published papers and mission websites. Most didn't respond. 2 sent brief replies referring me to NASA's Public Affairs Office. 1, who I won't name because they requested anonymity, replied with, "I appreciate your interest in this topic, but I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing analysis. I'd encourage you to check the official mission websites for updates as they become available. Not at liberty to discuss." That phrasing is deliberate. It suggests constraints, either legal or institutional, on what can be said publicly. Now let me show you what NASA has said, and how carefully those statements are constructed. On October 15th, the day the government shutdown ended, NASA's chief scientist, Dr. Tom Statler, gave an interview to NBC News. The reporter asked directly about speculation that 3 Atlas might be artificial. Statler's response: "It looks like a comet. It does comet things. The spectroscopy shows water, carbon dioxide, dust. Exactly what we'd expect from a comet. There's no evidence to suggest it's anything other than a natural object from another star system." That statement is technically accurate. The spectroscopy does show those molecules, but notice what's not addressed: the specific claims about geometric features, rotational precision, or spacecraft observations showing structural anomalies. Statler responded to the general alien spacecraft narrative. not to the detailed technical claims circulating in insider accounts. It's a rhetorical technique called misdirection. Address the extreme claim, it's an alien mothership, and your rebuttal sounds definitive. But you haven't actually engaged with the nuanced question, did spacecraft observe features inconsistent with natural cometary morphology? On October 3rd, I attended a virtual press conference about Webb Space Telescope observations of the outer solar system. During Q&A, I asked, Webb observed 3I Atlas in August. Are there plans to release additional observations from the perihelion period in late October, and if so, when can we expect that data? The response came from Dr. Caitlin Rasmussen, Webb's program scientist. Webb's observation schedule is publicly available on our website. Any observations that have been completed go through standard processing and are released to the archive according to our data policy. I don't have specific information about 3I Atlas observations beyond what's already been announced. That's non-answer. It sounds informative but provides no information. Was Webb tasked to observe in October? We don't know. If so, has that data been processed? We don't know. When will it be released? We don't know. The careful construction of these responses suggests legal or policy review. These are smart people who know how to communicate science clearly. When they're vague, it's usually because they've been instructed to be. Let me contrast this with ESA's communication style. On October 8th, ESA released a press statement about Mars Express and ExoMars TGO observations of 3I Atlas. The statement included low-resolution images, described the observing campaign, explained the limitations of imaging from that distance, and set expectations for when higher quality data products would be available. It was transparent, educational, open, NASA's equivalent communication, silence. Why the difference? ESA operates under different institutional constraints. They don't have the same classification authorities as US agencies. They're accountable to European member states with diverse political interests, making coordinated secrecy harder to maintain. And frankly, ESA has less to lose. If 3I Atlas observations show something controversial, it's not ESA's problem if that creates public debate or scientific uncertainty. But for NASA, operating within the US national security framework, adjacent to defense and intelligence agencies, with oversight from Congress and political appointees, the calculations are different. Releasing information that might spark public alarm or international concern requires careful consideration. And that consideration, I suspect, is ongoing. Here's another telling detail. NASA's budget justification documents for fiscal year 2026, submitted to Congress in early October, include a line item for interstellar object characterization and tracking. It's a small amount, $4.2 million, but it's new. It doesn't appear in previous years' budgets. The justification text is brief. Funding supports enhanced observational capabilities and data analysis for characterizing interstellar objects transiting the solar system, with focus on improving rapid response and multi-asset coordination. Enhanced observational capabilities, rapid response, multi-asset coordination. That's language you use when you've identified a gap in your capabilities and you're trying to fix it. It suggests lessons learned from 3I Atlas, recognition that the existing approach was inadequate. But inadequate for what? Studying a normal comet? Or responding to something unexpected that revealed limitations in how NASA handles anomalous observations? I filed another FOA request specifically for any internal documents related to this budget line item. I want to know what justification NASA provided internally for why this funding is necessary now, after 3I Atlas, when it wasn't necessary before. I don't expect answers quickly, but I expect the request itself sends a message. People are paying attention, people are asking questions, and eventually, through the accumulation of FOA requests, congressional inquiries, journalistic investigation, and persistent public interest, the truth will emerge. Because here's what I've learned covering space stories for over a decade. Secrets in science don't keep. Too many people are involved. Too many institutions have access. Too many competing. Interests prevent perfect coordination. NASA can delay, they can obfuscate, they can redirect attention. But they can't maintain perfect silence indefinitely. Someone will talk, data will leak, documents will be declassified, and when that happens, we'll know whether the insider claims were accurate or whether this whole story was much ado about nothing. But the fact that NASA is working this hard to maintain silence tells me the answer isn't nothing. Organizations don't deploy careful communication strategies, don't coordinate international data releases, don't create new budget line items for problems that don't exist. Something about 3i Atlas was significant enough to change how NASA operates, and until they tell us what that something was, the speculation will continue, the insider claims will multiply, and the public's trust in institutional transparency will erode further. That erosion is the real cost of silence, not the specific facts about one comet, but the broader message it sends: you can't be trusted with the truth. We'll tell you what we think you need to know, and we'll withhold the rest. That's not how science is supposed to work, and it's not how democracy is supposed to work either. Part 6. The Galileo Project Connection. I need to tell you about a conversation I had with someone unexpected. A member of the Galileo Project, the Harvard-led initiative searching for evidence of extraterrestrial technology. This person spoke on condition of anonymity, not because they're leaking classified information, but because they fear professional repercussions for discussing controversial topics. We've been tracking 3i Atlas since discovery, they told me. That's literally what the project was designed for: systematic searches for technological signatures in anomalous space objects. We have protocols, analysis pipelines, instruments specifically configured to detect non-natural features, and we've been trying to get observing time, trying to coordinate with NASA missions, trying to access spacecraft data. We've been shut out at every turn. The Galileo project, founded by Avi Loeb in 2021, operates independently of government agencies. They're privately funded, they answer to scientific advisory boards, not political appointees. In theory, they should have access to the same public data as any research group. In practice, different story. When we submitted proposals for observing time on NASA telescopes, they were rejected. Standard rejection language: not enough scientific merit, better proposals received, limited resources. But we know colleagues who submitted similar proposals for other comets and got approved. There's a selectivity happening specifically around 3i Atlas. I asked the obvious question: could your proposals have been legitimately weaker? The Galileo project's focus on techno-signatures is controversial. Maybe reviewers didn't think looking for artificial features in a known comet was scientifically justified. Maybe, they conceded. But here's what's strange. We requested access to publicly archived data from Hubble, Webb, and ground-based facilities. That's not asking for observing time, just requesting data that should be available to any researcher. And we were told the data processing was delayed, that certain observation sets were undergoing extended calibration, that we should check back later. When we checked back, we got the same answers. When you say extended calibration, I mean indefinitely delayed without clear justification. Look, I understand that data processing takes time. I understand that some observations require extra care to calibrate properly. But there's a pattern. Specific observation dates, September 4th, October 3rd, exactly the windows where spacecraft were optimally positioned. Those are the ones being held back. Earlier observations, later observations, those get released normally. It's just the critical window that's stuck in processing. This matches what I've heard from other sources. The data that would be most revealing, that would have the best resolution and coverage during peak comet activity, is precisely what's unavailable. I asked whether the Galileo project had considered that maybe NASA is being extra careful because they're dealing with a controversial subject and want to be absolutely certain before making claims. Of course we've considered that, they said. That's the charitable interpretation. NASA saw something ambiguous in spacecraft data, and they're taking time to rule out instrumental artifacts, to consult experts, to build consensus before publication. That's responsible science. But that process should be transparent. You announce that you've observed something interesting. You describe preliminary findings. You explain that more analysis is needed. You invite independent verification. You don't just disappear the data and hope nobody notices. They referenced a specific example, the WOW signal from 1977. That was one radio telescope, one observation, never repeated. But it was publicly reported immediately. Scientists discussed it openly even though they couldn't explain it. The data was shared, other researchers could analyze it, propose interpretations, design follow-up observations. That's how science handles anomalies, they continued. You make the data available and let the scientific community figure it out collectively. What's happening with 3i Atlas is the opposite. Centralized control. Limited access, delayed releases. That's not how you do science. That's how you do damage control. I pressed on whether damage control necessarily implied something nefarious. Maybe NASA just wants to avoid premature speculation, media circuses, public confusion. Sure. But whose job is it to decide what the public can handle? If spacecraft imaged 3I Atlas and saw features that don't fit simple natural explanations, don't we have a right to know? Even if the implications are unsettling? Even if it means admitting we don't understand something? We talked for another hour. They shared technical analyses the Galileo project had conducted based on limited publicly available data. Photometric modelling, spectral deconvolution, trajectory analysis. None of it was conclusive. They readily admitted that. But all of it pointed toward a comet with properties at the edge of, or just beyond, what natural formation processes would predict. We're not saying it's alien, they emphasised, we're saying it's anomalous, and anomalies deserve investigation, not suppression. If it turns out to be explainable through exotic but natural processes, great, we'll have learned something, but we need access to the data to make that determination. Before we ended the call, they said something that stuck with me. The irony is that Oumuamua was the opposite situation. That was the first interstellar object, totally unexpected, and everyone had access. Data was everywhere. People analysed it from every angle. The scientific community was engaged, transparent, vigorous in debate. Some of us thought it might be artificial. Most disagreed. But the discussion happened openly. With 3I Atlas, we have better instruments, better tracking, spacecraft optimally positioned, and silence. Why is the third interstellar object being handled so differently from the first? What changed between 2017 and 2025? That question haunts me. What did change? Maybe we learned lessons from Oumuamua. The speculation got out of hand. The media coverage was sensational. NASA decided next time they'd be more careful about controlling the narrative. Or maybe Oumuamua didn't show clear enough anomalies to justify secrecy. It was strange, yes, but ambiguous. Whereas 3I Atlas, with its close spacecraft encounters during peak activity, revealed something that crossed a threshold, something that demanded a different response. I don't have evidence for either interpretation. But the question is valid. Why the different treatment? And why is a legitimate research program, funded independently and staffed by credentialed scientists, being systematically denied access to data that should be public? The Galileo project contact ended with this. We're not giving up. We're filing FOIA requests. We're reaching out to international partners. We're building our own observing infrastructure so we're not dependent on NASA next time. Because there will be a next time. More interstellar objects will come, and when they do, we'll be ready to observe them independently. That's the silver lining in this story. The scientific community is adapting. Researchers who feel locked out of official channels are creating alternatives. Private funding, international collaboration, independent instruments. The democratization of space observation means that even if NASA wants to control information, they can't fully succeed. But we shouldn't have to build parallel systems to access truth about objects visiting our solar system. There's something fundamentally wrong when legitimate scientific inquiry is met with bureaucratic stonewalling and access denials. And it makes you wonder, if this is how they handle a comet, how would they handle something that left no room for ambiguity? Something that was unquestionably artificial, unquestionably from elsewhere, unquestionably intentional. Would we ever know? Or would the silence be so complete, the suppression so thorough, that the only traces would be anonymous posts on encrypted platforms and carefully deleted preprints? That's the nightmare scenario. Not that we'd discover evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but that we'd discover it and never be told. The insider claims, the deletion patterns, the institutional barriers, they all point toward a system that's prepared to withhold information it deems too sensitive for public disclosure. And once that system is in place, once the precedent is set, there's no clear mechanism to reverse it, unless we demand it. Unless we keep asking questions, filing requests, investigating patterns, and refusing to accept silence as an answer. That's what this investigation is about. Not proving aliens visited, not even proving the insider claims are accurate, but proving that we have a right to know what our spacecraft observed, what our scientists concluded, and what decisions were made on our behalf by people we never elected and can't hold accountable. The comet is leaving. But the questions remain, and they're not going away. Part 7. The timing was too perfect. Let's talk about something nobody wants to address directly. The probability that everything we've discussed happened by pure coincidence. September 4th, 2025. Psyche passes within 45 million kilometers of 3i Atlas, the closest any NASA deep space probe has come to an interstellar visitor. The spacecraft is healthy, its instruments are functioning, and the observation geometry is optimal. According to mission planning documents published in August by Marshall Eubanks and colleagues, this was identified as one of the 3 best opportunities to study the comet with spacecraft assets, and on that exact date, Psyche experiences what NASA describes as a minor telemetry anomaly. October 1st, 2025, midnight. The United States government shuts down due to congressional budget impasse. NASA's public communications infrastructure goes dark. Websites stop updating. Social media falls silent. The machinery that turns spacecraft observations into public knowledge is furloughed. 2 days later, on October 3rd, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, and potentially other Mars assets have their optimal viewing window for 3i Atlas. The comet passes within 29 million kilometers of Mars, closer than it will come to any planet during its entire passage through the solar system. The observations happen during a government blackout. When the shutdown ends on October 15th, no data has been released, no press announcements, no acknowledgement that the observations even occurred. November 4th, 2025. JUICE reaches its observation window. ESA announces the observations are happening. Then 2 weeks later, they announce a 4-month delay in data processing and release. Now, let me walk you through the mathematics of coincidence. The government shutdown was not scheduled around 3 Atlas. The comet's trajectory was determined by gravitational dynamics that were set in motion billions of years ago. The congressional budget impasse was the result of political negotiations completely unrelated to astronomy. These are independent variables. What's the probability that a government shutdown would occur within 48 hours of the Mars observation window for the solar system's 3rd ever confirmed interstellar visitor? Let's calculate. Government shutdowns in the United States have occurred approximately once every 3 years over the past 2 decades. That's a baseline probability. The critical observation window for Mars assets was October 17th, 2025, 7 days out of 365 in the year. If shutdowns are randomly distributed across time, the probability of one coinciding with that specific week is roughly 7/365, or about 1.9%. Not impossible, unlikely, but not impossible. But now factor in the Psyche anomaly. Spacecraft experience glitches. Solar flares cause communication disruptions. Cosmic rays flip bits and computer memory. These things happen, but they don't happen frequently during critical observation windows of once-in-a-lifetime targets. Psyche has been in space since October 2023. It's operated nominally for over 2 years. During those 730-plus days, it's had occasional minor issues, thruster calibrations, instrument power cycles, routine maintenance operations, but a telemetry disruption significant enough to interrupt data transmission during the 1 6-hour window when it had optimal viewing geometry for an interstellar object. Let's be conservative and say spacecraft communication anomalies occur once per 100 days of operation. That's probably generous. Modern spacecraft are quite reliable. The probability of an anomaly occurring during a specific 6-hour window is approximately 6/2400, or 0.25%. So we have Psyche anomaly during observation, 0.25% probability government shutdown during Mars window, 1.9% probability both occurring, 0.25% x 1.9%, 0.0475% probability. That's roughly 1 in 21,000. Not impossible, but sufficiently unlikely that it demands explanation beyond bad luck. Now add the ESA delay. Space agencies delay data releases. Processing takes time, but JUICE's delay was announced after NASA's silence had already become conspicuous. ESA operates independently, but they coordinate extensively with NASA on deep space missions. They share communication infrastructure. They collaborate on science planning. What's the probability that ESA would announce a 4-month delay in processing data from an observation that multiple sources claim showed anomalous features at exactly the time when NASA is facing questions about why their spacecraft observations haven't been released? I can't calculate that precisely because I don't have baseline statistics on ESA data release delays, but the timing is remarkable. Either we're witnessing an extraordinary confluence of unrelated coincidences, or there's a common cause linking these events, and the common cause, if it exists, is what was observed. Let me present a scenario that fits the timing. Psyche observes 3i Atlas on September 4th. During data transmission, mission controllers notice something in the preliminary images. Not artifacts, not noise, but features in the target itself. Features unexpected enough that someone decides this needs immediate attention. The spacecraft is commanded to stop transmitting that particular dataset and await further instructions. That's the telemetry anomaly. Mission scientists review the full data. They consult with colleagues. The consensus is that what Psyche saw is ambiguous. Could be natural, could be something else. A decision is made to wait for additional observations before making any public statements. The Mars window in early October will provide higher resolution data. Combined analysis of Psyche and MRO observations will clarify the situation. Then the government shuts down on October 1st. The Mars observations proceed as planned. Spacecraft operations are accepted activities. But there's no public affairs office to announce them. No communications team to prepare press releases. The data comes down, gets reviewed by the reduced staff, and is immediately flagged for the same reasons Psyche data was flagged. By the time the shutdown ends, the decision has been made. This data requires careful handling. Interagency coordination begins. NASA reaches out to ESA, explains the situation, requests that JUICE observations be processed in coordination with NASA's eventual data release. ESA agrees, announces a delay, and both agencies settle into a holding pattern while they figure out how to present findings that challenge expectations. That scenario requires no conspiracy, no malice, just institutional caution in the face of observations that don't fit neat categories, scientists uncomfortable with ambiguity, administrators worried about public reaction, politicians concerned about the political implications of announcing something they don't fully understand. But it requires that something was observed, something significant enough to trigger this coordinated response. The alternative is that all of this, the Psyche anomaly, the shutdown timing, the Mars data gaps, the ESA delay, is genuinely coincidental. Random chance produced a pattern that looks intentional but isn't. I'm a journalist, not a statistician, but I understand probability well enough to know that when low probability events cluster together, you look for common causes. You don't just shrug and say, weird coincidence. And here's what makes me most suspicious. Nobody in authority is addressing the timing question directly. When I've interviewed NASA officials, when I've asked about the remarkable coincidence of the shutdown occurring exactly during the Mars observation window, I get responses that address individual elements, but not the pattern. The shutdown was beyond NASA's control. True, but doesn't address why data from before and after the shutdown has been released while October 1 to 7 remains absent from archives. Spacecraft operations continued during the shutdown. True, but doesn't address why no results from those operations have been shared publicly. Data processing takes time. True, but doesn't explain why some datasets get processed in weeks while others remain pending after months. Each response is technically accurate, but none of them address the central question: why does the timing look so suspicious? Let me give you a comparison. In 2013, the Chelyabinsk meteor exploded over Russia. Nobody predicted it. The object was small, detected only after it was already in the atmosphere. Within hours, thousands of dashboard camera videos were circulating online. Within days, scientists had calculated the trajectory, estimated the size, and begun analysing fragments. The event was sudden, unexpected, and yet the global scientific community responded with transparency and speed. 3i Atlas was detected in July. We had months of warning. We knew the trajectory, knew when spacecraft would be optimally positioned, had time to plan observations and coordinate international efforts. And yet 6 months later, we still don't have data from the most critical observation windows. That contrast is telling. When nobody has advance warning, when there's no time for institutional decision-making, information flows freely. But when agencies have time to think, to consult, to coordinate, that's when information starts getting controlled. The timing of the 3i Atlas observation windows gave NASA time to implement whatever protocols they have for handling sensitive astronomical data. The shutdown provided cover for the initial data blackout, and the months since have been used to coordinate with international partners and prepare for whatever disclosure strategy has been decided upon. I'm not claiming to know what that strategy is. Maybe they're preparing to announce something extraordinary. Maybe they're preparing to announce something mundane after months of unnecessary secrecy, and they're trying to figure out how to explain the delay without looking incompetent. But the timing, the suspicious, improbable, statistically anomalous timing, tells me this wasn't accidental. Something about 3i Atlas observations triggered a response that required coordination across multiple agencies and institutions, and that response is still ongoing. The question is, what did they see that required this level of careful management, and when will they trust us with the answer? Part 8. The scientific community is fracturing. There's something happening in astronomical circles that I need to describe because it's unprecedented in my experience covering space science. The community is dividing into camps, and the division is becoming hostile. I attended the American Astronomical Society meeting in January 2026. Yes, this is being written in early January, and the meeting just concluded. There was a session on interstellar objects, papers on Oumuamua, Borisov, theoretical predictions for detection rates, proposals for future observation programs, standard academic fare. 3i Atlas was conspicuously absent from the session. During coffee breaks, in hallway conversations, at evening receptions, the comet was all anyone wanted to discuss. But not in sessions, not in formal presentations, not on the record. I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a planetary scientist from MIT who's published extensively on comet composition. She wouldn't let me record the conversation, but she agreed to speak on background. "There's a memo," she said quietly. "Not official, not written down, but everyone knows. Don't present work on 3i Atlas until after the coordinated data release. Don't publish preprints. Don't give interviews. Wait for the official results to come out, then you can respond to them, but don't get ahead of the curve." "Who issued this memo?" I asked. "Nobody. That's the point. It's not an order. It's an understanding. You see what happened to Marcus Chen. You see papers getting withdrawn. You see FOIA requests going unanswered. You understand that there's a preferred narrative, and if you deviate from it, your career will suffer, so you wait." Is that how science is supposed to work? Of course not. But it's how science does work when politics and institutional interests override the scientific method. She gestured around the conference center. Hundreds of astronomers, planetary scientists, spectroscopists, and orbital dynamicists. Experts in exactly the fields relevant to understanding 3i Atlas. "Every person here could contribute to analysing this object," she said. "We have the expertise, the tools, the interest, but we're all waiting for permission to speak, and that permission is being withheld." I talked to 24 scientists over 3 days at that conference. The conversations followed similar patterns. Public statements were cautious, deferring to official NASA positions. Private conversations were much more candid. One young postdoc told me, "I have data. Ground-based observations from a facility I won't name. The photometry shows variations that don't match any rotation model I've tried. I want to publish. My advisor says wait. The program director at our funding agency says wait. Everyone says wait. So I'm sitting on potentially important findings because nobody wants to be first." An established professor with decades of experience said, "I've published hundreds of papers. I've never been afraid of the peer review. But I'm afraid now, not of being wrong. Being wrong is part of science. I'm afraid of being right and having that truth be inconvenient for people with power." This is the fracturing I'm talking about. Scientists are afraid, not of the data, but of the consequences of analysing it honestly. And the division isn't just about fear, it's ideological. There's a camp that believes the caution is justified. They point to the Oumuamua debacle, the sensational headlines, the damage to scientific credibility when speculation got ahead of evidence. They argue that NASA is being responsible by waiting until all data is analysed thoroughly before making statements. Better slow and careful than fast and wrong. Then there's the camp that believes the caution has crossed into suppression. They point to the data gaps, the withdrawn papers, the institutional barriers to independent research. They argue that science requires transparency, that hiding data, even temporarily, violates the fundamental principle that knowledge belongs to everyone. The two camps aren't communicating productively. Conversations devolve into accusations. The first camp calls the second conspiracy theorists. The second camp calls the first institutional apologists. Both sides are entrenched. And in the middle are the majority of scientists who just want to do their work, publish their findings, and not get caught in political crossfire. This fracturing matters because science is a collective enterprise. Progress happens through collaboration, debate, and the free exchange of ideas. When fear and politics enter the equation, when researchers are worried about career consequences more than scientific truth, the whole system breaks down. I witnessed this breakdown firsthand during a session on planetary defense, detecting and tracking near-Earth objects that might pose collision threats. One presenter showed a slide about improved tracking capabilities for long-period comets and interstellar objects. During Q&A, someone asked, "Given the lessons learned from tracking 3i Atlas, what improvements are being prioritized?" The presenter paused, visibly uncomfortable. "That's outside the scope of this presentation. I'd refer you to NASA's published strategic plans for space situational awareness." The person asking the question pressed, "But 3i Atlas demonstrated gaps in our observational capabilities, specifically the difficulty of coordinating spacecraft observations during optimal windows. Surely that's relevant to this discussion." The session chair intervened. "We're running short on time. Let's move to the next question." That's academic code for "we're not discussing this." And everyone in the room understood. Later I approached the original questioner, Dr. Raymond Ose, a researcher from South Africa who works on asteroid tracking. He agreed to speak on record. "It's absurd," he told me. "We're scientists at a scientific conference discussing science, and we can't ask basic questions about a major astronomical event because it's been deemed politically sensitive. How is that acceptable? Why do you think it's sensitive? Because it reveals incompetence, or it reveals something they're not ready to disclose, or both. Either NASA's coordination with Mars assets was poorly executed and they don't want to admit it, or the coordination worked perfectly and they don't want to share what they found. In either case, honest scientific discussion becomes impossible." Dr. Ose's frustration echoed what I'd heard from dozens of others. Scientists feel shut out of analysis of one of the most interesting astronomical objects in recent memory. They have expertise to contribute, data to share, questions to ask, and they're being told, implicitly or explicitly, to stay quiet. This isn't just about 3i Atlas anymore, it's about whether the scientific community can maintain its independence from political and institutional pressures, whether scientists can ask inconvenient questions without fear of professional retaliation, whether data about objects visiting our solar system belongs to the public or to gatekeepers who decide what we're allowed to know. The fracturing I'm describing isn't healing, it's widening. Every month that passes without data release, every FOA request that goes unanswered, every paper that gets mysteriously withdrawn deepens the divisions. Some scientists are adapting by withdrawing from public engagement entirely. They focus on work that can't be politicized, that doesn't touch controversial topics. They publish in specialized journals, present at small workshops, avoid media attention. Others are radicalizing. They're filing more aggressive FOIA requests, publishing on open platforms that can't be censored, speaking to journalists even when their institutions advise against it. They've decided that scientific integrity requires public advocacy, not quiet compliance. And a small but growing number are leaving academia altogether, starting private companies, joining independent research institutes, seeking funding outside traditional channels. They've concluded that the institutional structure of science has been compromised, and the only way to do honest work is outside that structure. I don't know which response is correct. Maybe all of them are necessary. Maybe the fracturing, as painful as it is how the scientific community adapts to an era where space exploration has become politicized in ways previous generations didn't face. But I do know this. When scientists are afraid to analyze data honestly, when careers are threatened by asking questions, when institutional pressure overrides scientific curiosity, we all lose. Not just the researchers whose work is suppressed, but society as a whole. Because scientific progress depends on freedom of inquiry, and that freedom is under threat. The 3i Atlas situation is a test case. How the scientific community responds to this challenge will set precedents for how future discoveries are handled. If transparency wins, if data is released and independent analysis is encouraged, then we'll have demonstrated that science can resist political pressure. If suppression wins, if the data remains locked away and dissenting voices are marginalized, then we'll have established that institutional power trumps scientific truth. The outcome isn't determined yet. The battle is ongoing, and the scientists I spoke with at that conference, the ones willing to speak honestly even at risk to their careers, they're the front line of that battle. They deserve our support, and they deserve the data that's being withheld. Part 9. What the models say shouldn't exist. Let me get technical for a moment. Because buried in the academic literature, in papers that don't make headlines, there's modelling work that should concern us. Dr. Yuki Tanaka at Kyoto University published a paper in Icarus in November 2025 titled Thermal Models of Interstellar Cometary Nuclei: Constraints from 3I Atlas Observations. The paper isn't about anomalies or artifacts. It's straightforward physics, applying heat transfer equations to estimate the internal temperature profile of the nucleus based on observed outgassing rates. Here's what Tanaka found. The observed gas production rates are too high for the estimated nucleus size unless the comet has unusually high thermal conductivity, meaning heat from sunlight penetrates deeper into the nucleus than models predict for typical ice-dust mixtures. High thermal conductivity means the interior is conducting heat efficiently. In natural cometary ices mixed with dust, conductivity is low. Heat doesn't penetrate far. The surface heats up and releases gas, but the deep interior remains cold. That's why comets can make multiple passes around the Sun without sublimating completely. But if 3I Atlas has high thermal conductivity, that suggests either a composition different from normal comets or a structure that facilitates heat transfer. Tanaka proposes fractures, voids, or layered architecture that allows heat to spread throughout the nucleus. Fractures and voids are natural. Comets develop them through thermal stress and outgassing. But the specific conductivity value Tanaka calculates to match observations is higher than any natural structure in his model database. His conclusion section includes this carefully worded statement. The apparent thermal conductivity inferred from observations exceeds values measured in laboratory analogues of cometary material by a factor of 3.5. This discrepancy may indicate unusual porosity or compositional variations not previously encountered in cometary science. Alternative structural models should be explored. Alternative structural models is academic code for "this doesn't make sense and I don't know why." Then there's work by Dr. Sofia Ramirez at the University of California, Berkeley. Her paper, published in the Astrophysical Journal in October 2025, analyzes the light curve, brightness variations over time, using advanced shape modeling techniques. Standard approach: you assume the nucleus is an ellipsoid or irregular solid, model how brightness changes as it rotates, and fit the model to observations. Ramirez did this with 3I Atlas data from July through September. Her models didn't fit. No matter what shape parameters she tried, the predicted light curve didn't match observations. The discrepancy wasn't huge, a few percent, but it was systematic and couldn't be explained by measurement uncertainty. She tried more complex shapes, triaxial ellipsoids with varying axis ratios, contact binaries, two lobes stuck together, elongated needles. Nothing worked perfectly. Finally, she tried a model with discrete reflective components, meaning regions on the surface with significantly different optical properties, dark areas that absorb light, bright areas that reflect strongly. That model fit better, but it required the reflective components to be precisely arranged in a pattern that maximizes brightness variations at specific rotation angles. Her discussion section: the optimal model suggests surface heterogeneity beyond typical cometary albedo variations. The spatial distribution of high and low reflectivity regions is non-random, potentially indicating geological processes or compositional layering not fully understood. Again, careful language, but the message is clear. The surface properties don't match what random natural processes should produce. A third paper, this one by Dr. James Chen at Johns Hopkins, focuses on spectroscopy. He compiled all publicly available spectral observations of 3I Atlas from July through November and looked for time-variable features, emission or absorption lines that changed intensity as the nucleus rotated. Most comets show some spectral variability. Different areas of the surface release different molecules depending on composition and temperature. Chen expected to find that pattern. What he found was more organized than expected. Certain emission lines, specifically CN, cyanogen, and C2, diatomic carbon, showed periodic variations that were exactly in phase with the rotation period, meaning specific locations on the nucleus were consistently releasing these molecules. That's not weird by itself. Active areas on comets can be localized. but the phase relationship was perfect. Zero lag between rotation and emission. That means whatever is producing these molecules is responding instantaneously to solar illumination, with no delay for heat to penetrate subsurface layers. Chen's interpretation. The immediate spectral response to rotations suggests active regions with minimal insulating overburden. This is consistent with either recent exposure of fresh ices or ongoing resurfacing processes. Recent exposure or ongoing resurfacing on a comet that's been travelling through interstellar space for billions of years. That's strange. None of these papers, individually as damning, each presents a puzzle that could have natural explanations: unusual porosity, geological activity, compositional heterogeneity. Science is full of puzzles that get resolved with more data and better models. But when you read them together, when you see that multiple independent researchers analysing different aspects of 3I Atlas are all finding properties that push the boundaries of what country models predict, a pattern emerges. The pattern is, this object is unusual in subtle but consistent ways across multiple measurement techniques. And here's what concerns me. All three of these papers are based on ground-based observations from July through September. None of them include spacecraft data from the October windows. If ground-based observations limited by atmospheric seeing and distance revealed these anomalies, what did spacecraft see with their superior resolution and sensitivity? That's the question the modelling work raises, and it's a question we can't answer without the data that's being withheld. I reached out to all three researchers. Tanaka didn't respond. Ramirez sent a brief email saying she's not comfortable discussing 3I Atlas in interviews. Chen replied with, "I'd be happy to discuss my published work. I have no knowledge of spacecraft observations or any information beyond what's in the public domain." That last phrase, "no knowledge of spacecraft observations," struck me as carefully phrased. He's stating for the record that he hasn't seen classified data, hasn't been briefed by NASA, is working purely from public sources. That's protective language, establishing that if his work comes close to sensitive topics, it's unintentional. Scientists are scared, and when scientists are scared of their own data, something is very wrong. Let me end this section with a thought experiment. Imagine you're a NASA mission planner. You're reviewing preliminary data from MRO's October 3rd observation of 3I Atlas. You see features that don't immediately make sense. Linear structures, organised brightness patterns, spectral signatures that don't match your database of cometary volatiles. You have two options. Option A, release the data immediately. Let the global scientific community analyse it. Accept that there will be speculation, sensational headlines, and public confusion. Trust that through open debate and additional observations the truth will emerge. Option B, hold the data while you consult experts. Build models, rule out instrumental artifacts, coordinate with other agencies who also observe the comet. Only release information once you have a consensus interpretation that you can present clearly and definitively. Which option do you choose? Option A is scientifically correct. It's how science is supposed to work, but it's risky. If the preliminary features turn out to be artifacts and you've already released data suggesting something anomalous, you've created a credibility problem. The public might not accept your later explanation that it was all a mistake. Option B is politically safe. It protects you from embarrassment, but it delays scientific progress, frustrates researchers, and breeds suspicion. If the features are real and important, you've wasted months during which independent analysis could have been advancing understanding. NASA appears to have chosen option B. Whether that's the right choice depends on what the data actually shows. If it's legitimately ambiguous, requiring careful analysis to distinguish instrumental effects from real features, then delay is justified. But if it's clear and NASA is simply afraid of the implications, then delay is indefensible. The modelling work I've described suggests the truth is somewhere in between. The comet shows properties that are unusual but not impossible, features that require explanation but might have natural causes, exactly the kind of ambiguous situation where institutional caution conflicts with scientific transparency, and in that conflict we're seeing transparency lose. Part 10. The international dimension. There's an angle to this story that doesn't get discussed enough. 3I Atlas. Observations weren't just an American effort. Multiple countries, multiple space agencies, multiple independent observatories collected data, and those international observations create complications for any suppression effort. Let me walk you through who was watching and what that means for information control. China. The Tianwen-1 Mars orbiter was optimally positioned during the October 3rd close approach. Tianwen-1 carries high-resolution cameras comparable to NASA's HiRISE. If NASA's Mars assets observed 3i Atlas, so did China's. Chinese space program operates with limited transparency. They release data selectively, often through state media channels, and don't maintain the kind of open archives that NASA and ESA do. But they do release information, usually after careful political review. As of early January 2026, China has said nothing publicly about Tianwen-1 observations of 3i Atlas. No images, no mention in official press releases, no scientific papers from Chinese astronomers analysing the October data. That silence could mean they didn't observe, could mean they're processing data on their own timeline, or could mean they observed something and decided, independently or in coordination with other space powers, not to publish. United Arab Emirates, the Hope Mars mission, launched by UAE in 2020, was also at Mars during October. Hope carries instruments designed to study the Martian atmosphere, not distant comets. But its ultraviolet spectrometer could potentially detect emissions from 3i Atlas's coma if the comet was bright enough. UAE Space Agency is young, ambitious, and eager to demonstrate capabilities. They typically embrace publicity for their achievements. Their silence about any potential 3i Atlas observations is notable. Russia. Roscosmos operates instruments on ESA's ExoMars Trace. Gas Orbiter is a joint mission, Russian equipment, European spacecraft. Any observations TGO made would be accessible to both agencies. Russia's space program has become more opaque in recent years, especially after geopolitical tensions increased. Data sharing with Western agencies is more constrained than it was a decade ago. If TGO observed something controversial, Russia's willingness to coordinate with ESA on data release might be limited. India. The Mars Orbiter mission, Mangalyaan, was India's first interplanetary mission. Launched in 2013, it's still operational as of 2025, though some instruments have degraded. The spacecraft wasn't optimally positioned for 3i Atlas observations, but it was there. India's space agency hasn't mentioned the comet in any context. The international dimension creates both opportunities and complications for managing information. Opportunity. If multiple independent observers see the same thing, that's powerful corroboration. International agreement on findings lends credibility. A joint NASA-ESA-CNSA announcement carries more weight than any single agency speaking alone. Complication. Coordinating message across multiple agencies with different political systems, institutional cultures, and accountability structures is difficult. One agency might want transparency, while another prefers secrecy. One might want immediate publication, while another needs political approval that takes months. Achieving consensus is slow, and if consensus can't be reached, then you get what we're seeing: silence from everyone. Because no agency wants to publish findings that contradict potential partners. Better to say nothing than to create international diplomatic complications. I spoke with Dr. Michael Torres, a space policy analyst at the Secure World Foundation. His perspective: when you have observations of something unusual, and that something is moving through space that belongs to no nation, you immediately enter complicated territorial and diplomatic waters. Who has authority to characterize the object? Who gets to make announcements? If one nation claims it's artificial and others disagree, who adjudicates? There's no established protocol. So agencies default to coordination, I asked. They default to caution. Everyone waits for everyone else. Nobody wants to be first because being first means taking political and credibility risks. If you're NASA and you announce something extraordinary, and then China releases data contradicting you, you look foolish, so you wait for China, but China is waiting for you. Stalemate. Is there any mechanism to break the stalemate? Public pressure, eventually. Media attention. Congressional oversight. International scientific community demanding access. Enough external pressure forces agencies to either publish or explicitly justify withholding. But that pressure takes time to build. We're building it now. This investigation, other journalistic inquiries, FOIA requests, scientific papers pointing to anomalies, all of this creates pressure. How much pressure is needed before the system yields? I don't know. But history suggests it's substantial. Consider parallels. When the US military encountered unidentified aerial phenomena, UFOs, the official response was decades of denial and dismissal. It wasn't until pilots went public, videos leaked, and congressional members demanded answers that the Pentagon acknowledged they had data they couldn't explain. Even then, the full disclosure process is ongoing and incomplete. 3i Atlas could follow a similar trajectory. Years of official denial, slow leaks of information, gradually increasing pressure, eventually partial acknowledgement that unusual features were observed without full disclosure of data. The process measured in years, not months, unless something forces acceleration, a major leak, a foreign government breaking ranks and publishing their observations, a catastrophic failure in the containment strategy. That's what I'm watching for. The crack in the facade. The moment when information control breaks down and truth floods through. International observations make that moment more likely. Because coordinating secrecy across rival nations is exponentially harder than maintaining it within a single agency. Someone, somewhere, will calculate that the benefits of disclosure outweigh the costs, and when they do, the entire house of cards collapses. China in particular has both capability and potential motivation to break the silence. If Chinese scientists analysed Tianwen-1 data and found evidence supporting the anomalous features the insider claims describe, publishing that would be a significant propaganda victory. China discovers what America tried to hide would be a powerful narrative, but so far, nothing. Which suggests either Chinese data doesn't support the anomalous interpretation, or China is participating in the coordination strategy, or China is waiting for the optimal moment to weaponize information. All three possibilities remain open. The international dimension also affects how I evaluate the insider claims. If suppression were purely an American initiative, we'd expect to see discrepancies between US and non-US data releases. ESA would publish, NASA wouldn't. Chinese astronomers would analyze and discuss while Americans stayed silent. Instead, the silence is fairly uniform. That suggests either all major space agencies independently concluded the data requires careful handling. Informal coordination is happening at levels we don't see. There's nothing particularly special in the data, and the delays are genuinely bureaucratic. I lean toward option 2, based on everything I've learned about how space agencies interact during major discoveries. There are established communication channels, senior officials talk, scientists collaborate. When something potentially significant appears, word spreads quickly through networks that exist outside formal structures. That communication doesn't require conspiracy, it just requires phone calls. Hey, we observed 3i Atlas during its Mars flyby and saw some interesting features in the data. We're taking time to analyze before releasing. Are you planning observations, want to coordinate so our announcements align? Professional courtesy, normal scientific collaboration, but with the effect of synchronizing silence. And that synchronized silence is why this story matters internationally, because space is a commons. Objects passing through the solar system don't belong to any nation. Observations made by publicly funded space agencies using taxpayer resources should serve public interest globally, not national interest narrowly. When agencies coordinate to withhold information, they're making decisions about what humanity should know. Not what Americans should know, or Europeans or Chinese, what everyone should know, and they're making those decisions without public input or democratic oversight. That's a problem bigger than one comet. It's about governance of space exploration in an era where multiple nations have capabilities, but no clear framework exists for managing information about discoveries that might have profound implications. 3i Atlas is forcing these questions into the open, and regardless of what the data ultimately shows, the process we're witnessing, the international coordination of silence, sets precedents that will affect how future discoveries are handled for decades to come. Part 11. What happens next? The timeline of truth. We're approaching critical inflection points, not hypothetical future dates, but concrete deadlines when decisions must be made and silence becomes unsustainable. February 2026 was ESA's original promise for JUICE data release. That deadline passed with an announcement of delay until June 2026. But June isn't hypothetical anymore. We're in January as I write this. 5 months until ESA either delivers or explains why they can't. Let me walk you through what each possible outcome means. Scenario 1. ESA releases complete data in June. If ESA publishes full observational datasets from JUICE's November observation window, raw images, calibrated spectra, instrument telemetry, observation logs, that's transparency. If that data shows a comet behaving normally, with brightness variations consistent with rotation, spectral features matching known volatiles, and no geometric anomalies, then the insider claims are either wrong or specific to NASA's observations. That would be significant. It would mean either the anomalies reported by anonymous sources don't exist, or they exist but only appear under specific viewing geometries that NASA assets had, but JUICE didn't. The former suggests the insider accounts are fabricated or misunderstood. The latter suggests something about 3i Atlas changes depending on how you look at it, which is itself deeply strange. But here's the critical test. Will independent researchers be able to access and analyze ESA's data? Will it be posted to public archives in standard formats that anyone with appropriate software can examine? Or will it be released through selective publications, processed and interpreted by ESA scientists before the broader community sees it? The difference matters. Raw data release allows verification. Processed-only release requires trust that ESA's interpretations are complete and accurate. If ESA chooses the latter approach, it suggests coordination with NASA to control narrative. Scenario 2. ESA delays again, beyond June. Another delay would be devastating to credibility. One postponement can be explained by technical issues. Two postponements suggest either profound dysfunction or deliberate stalling. And if the second delay coincides with any NASA announcements or data releases, the coordination becomes undeniable. Watch for the timing. If in May 2026, NASA suddenly announces they'll be releasing Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter data in August, and then ESA announces JUICE data is delayed until August to coordinate multi-mission analysis, that's not coincidence, that's orchestration. Scenario 3. ESA releases partial data. This is the most likely outcome based on historical patterns. ESA publishes processed images showing the comet, provides summary statistics about brightness and spectral features, releases scientific papers interpreting findings. But the raw data, the unprocessed observations that would allow independent verification, remains in processing indefinitely. This scenario gives the appearance of transparency while maintaining control. ESA can say they've released results, scientists can publish findings, but the underlying data that would allow someone to check whether the processing introduced artifacts or whether alternative interpretations are possible stays locked away. If this happens, watch for what's emphasized and what's omitted. If ESA's papers focus extensively on confirming the comet's natural composition, while briefly mentioning some unexpected photometric variations requiring further study, that tells you where the anomalies are. Scientists are very good at burying uncomfortable findings in technical language and subordinate clauses. Now, let's talk about NASA's timeline, which is less explicit but equally revealing. March 2026, Congressional Budget Hearings. NASA's fiscal year 2027 budget request will be examined by House and Senate Appropriations Committees. These hearings are public. Transcripts are published. Members of Congress, particularly those on science and space subcommittees, will ask about mission successes and scientific achievements from the past year. 3i Atlas is a perfect example to cite. Your missions observed the third ever interstellar visitor during its passage through our solar system. What did we learn? What discoveries were made? How does this justify the funding we're providing? NASA administrators will have to answer. They can't simply say no comment when asked directly by congressional oversight. They'll either provide substantive information about observations and findings, or they'll give carefully worded non-answers that will prompt follow-up questions. I'm watching those hearings closely. I've already submitted questions through my congressional representative's office, asking specifically about spacecraft observations of 3i Atlas and why data hasn't been released. Whether those questions get asked during the actual hearing depends on whether staff has prioritized them, but the fact that constituents are asking puts pressure on members to address the topic. April 2026, Fiscal Year 2027, Data Archive Deadlines. NASA's data policy requires that mission data be archived and made publicly available within specific timeframes after collection. For most missions, that's 6 to 12 months. We're now 6+ months past the September Psyche observation and 5+ months past the October MRO observations. If data doesn't appear in archives by the end of fiscal year 2025, September 30th, 2026, That's a policy violation that requires documentation and justification. Someone has to sign paperwork explaining why standard procedures weren't followed. Those documents are subject to FOIA. I've already filed a request for any data embargo or classification decisions related to 3i Atlas observations. The request might take a year or more to process, but eventually I'll get either documents or a formal denial with legal justification. Either outcome is informative. Summer 2026. Scientific conference season. The Division for Planetary Sciences meeting happens in September 2026. European Planetary Science Congress is in July. These are the major venues where planetary scientists present new research. If NASA and ESA have completed their analysis and reached consensus on how to present findings, summer conferences are natural venues for announcement. Watch for late-breaking abstracts about 3i Atlas. Watch for special sessions that get added to the program after initial schedules are published. Also watch for what doesn't appear. If major researchers who've published on interstellar objects aren't presenting anything about 3i Atlas, that's notable. It suggests they either don't have data or have been discouraged from presenting it. November 2026, 1 year after JUICE observations. There's an informal rule in astronomy. If you're sitting on data for more than a year without publishing, you're doing something wrong. Either the analysis is stuck, you're pursuing a dead end, or institutional barriers are preventing publication. If we reach November 2026 without JUICE results, the scientific community will start asking questions loudly and publicly. Journal editors will be contacted. Professional organizations will be petitioned. The pressure from within the astronomical community will intensify dramatically. That's when leaks become most likely. Frustrated scientists who've been patient for a year will start looking for ways to get information into public domain. Papers will be submitted to open access preprint servers without institutional approval. Data will be accidentally posted to public repositories. Conference presentations will include more provocative preliminary findings than advisors recommended. The dam will start to crack. Now let me tell you what I'm doing personally to accelerate this timeline. I've filed 12 separate FOIA requests with NASA, targeting different offices and mission directorates. Each request is specific: observation logs, data processing reports, interagency correspondence, classification decisions. The requests are worded carefully to make denial difficult without explicit legal justification. I'm coordinating with other journalists. We're sharing information, comparing notes, avoiding duplicating effort. When one person's FOIA request gets denied, others file similar requests worded differently. We're probing for weak points in the information barriers. I'm maintaining contact with the anonymous sources who initially reached out. Not all of them. Some have gone completely silent, but a few remain willing to share information incrementally. They can't give me documents or images without risking detection, but they can tell me what to look for, where to focus attention, which public data sets contain subtle clues. One source recently told me, "Watch the Minor Planet Center orbital updates. They're still refining 3i Atlas's trajectory based on observations through October. If the non-gravitational parameters change significantly in the next update, that's meaningful. It would mean the comet's motion isn't being fully explained by their models." I'm watching. The most recent orbital solution was published January 8, 2026. The non-gravitational acceleration term has increased by 15% compared to the November solution. That's within uncertainty ranges, possibly not significant, but it's trending in the direction of this object is accelerating more than outgassing alone would predict. I'm also building relationships with international sources, scientists in China, India, UAE, anyone who might have access to observations from national space programs that don't face the same political constraints as NASA. These relationships take time to develop. Trust must be earned, but eventually information flows, and I'm writing. This investigation, these scripts, these detailed examinations of patterns and timelines, they create a public record. They demonstrate that people are paying attention, that questions are being asked, that silence isn't being accepted passively. Every time I publish, I get emails. Some are from conspiracy theorists who want validation for extreme claims I'm not making. I ignore those. But some are from scientists, from people who work in the space industry, from government employees who see things that concern them. Those emails, even when they don't provide concrete evidence, help me understand the institutional dynamics at play. The timeline of truth isn't just about waiting for official announcements. It's about applying pressure, creating accountability, building networks of informed observers who can't be easily dismissed or silenced. It's about making the cost of continued secrecy higher than the cost of disclosure. And that cost calculation is shifting. Every month that passes without data release, NASA's credibility erodes. Every conference where 3i Atlas can't be discussed openly, the scientific community's frustration grows. Every FOIA denial, every unexplained delay, every carefully worded non-answer adds to the pressure. Eventually, the pressure will exceed the system's ability to contain it. That's when we'll get answers. Maybe not complete answers, maybe not satisfying answers, but answers of some kind, forced out by the weight of accumulated questions that can no longer be deflected. We're getting close to that point. The next 6 months will tell us whether the system can hold or whether it breaks. And if it breaks, what floods out will redefine how we think about space exploration, institutional transparency, and what happens when humanity encounters something that doesn't fit our categories. Part 12. The hypothesis nobody wants to state. Let me be direct about something I've been dancing around for 20,000 words. There is a hypothesis that explains every pattern we've documented, every gap in the data, every instance of institutional coordination, every anonymous claim from insiders. It's a hypothesis nobody in authority will state publicly because stating it carries implications that are too destabilizing to manage casually. The hypothesis is this. When spacecraft imaged 3i Atlas during September and October 2025, they observed features that are difficult to reconcile with natural formation processes and that warrant consideration of artificial origin. Not proof, not certainty. Just enough ambiguity that responsible institutions concluded they needed time to investigate thoroughly before making public statements that would inevitably be interpreted as NASA says it might be aliens. Let me be very clear about what I am and am not claiming here. I am not claiming that 3i Atlas is definitely artificial. I don't have evidence for that. The speculative features described by anonymous sources could be misinterpretations, could be instrumental artifacts, could have natural explanations we haven't thought of yet. What I am claiming is that the pattern of suppression, the coordination across international agencies, the career consequences for researchers asking questions, the carefully constructed non-answers from officials, all of this is consistent with institutions handling observations that cross a threshold of ambiguity, sufficient to trigger protocols for managing potentially paradigm-shifting information. Those protocols exist. They're not secret. After the 1960 Brookings report suggested NASA should consider how to communicate potential discoveries of extraterrestrial life, after decades of UFO reports that required institutional responses, after the development of SETI programs that needed frameworks for handling detections, space agencies and governments have thought carefully about these scenarios. The protocols emphasize caution, verify observations multiple times, rule out all natural explanations, consult with experts across relevant disciplines, coordinate with other agencies and international partners, prepare public communication strategies. Only then, when confidence is high and messaging is prepared, make announcements. These protocols are designed to prevent premature claims that turn out to be wrong. The Mars meteorite incident from 1996, when NASA announced possible evidence of ancient microbial life in a Martian rock, only to have the findings disputed by later analysis, taught institutions to be more careful about extraordinary claims. But these protocols also create exactly the information vacuum we're experiencing with 3i Atlas. Months of silence while analysis proceeds, coordinated messaging across agencies, barriers to independent research, all defensible as responsible caution, but indistinguishable from active suppression. So how do you distinguish responsible caution from suppression? You look at transparency about the process itself. Responsible caution would look like this. We've made observations of 3i Atlas that show unexpected features. We're conducting detailed analysis to determine whether these features are instrumental artifacts, natural phenomena we haven't seen before, or something requiring alternative explanations. We expect this analysis to take X months. We'll provide updates as our understanding improves. That statement acknowledges observations occurred, explains why results aren't immediate, sets expectations for timing, and commits to eventual disclosure. It's transparent about the process even while the conclusions are uncertain. What we're seeing instead, Silence about whether observations occurred. No timeline for data release. No acknowledgement of unusual features. Only generic statements about the comet being natural based on spectroscopy that doesn't address the specific features insider sources describe. That's suppression. Maybe justified suppression if the implications are genuinely that significant. But suppression nonetheless. Now let me walk you through what the artificial hypothesis would actually mean, because most people misunderstand it. If 3i Atlas has components or features that suggest engineering, that doesn't mean little green men are flying around in a spaceship. It could mean, possibility 1, ancient derelict. An automated probe launched millions or billions of years ago by a civilization that might no longer exist. The probe failed, its systems degraded, and it's been drifting through interstellar space, accumulating ice and dust that now forms the cometary coma. What spacecraft imaged might be fragments of the original structure visible through the coma. Possibility 2, hybrid object. A natural comet nucleus that was visited or modified by an automated system at some point in its history. Perhaps a probe from another civilization used the comet as raw material, hollowed it out for shelter, or attached instruments to it. The majority of what we see is natural ice and rock, but there are artificial components embedded within or attached to it. Possibility 3, deliberate camouflage. An active probe designed to look like a comet to avoid detection. This is the least likely scenario because it requires sophisticated intent and ongoing function, but it's not impossible. If an advanced civilization wanted to observe planetary systems covertly, disguising probes as natural objects would be an effective strategy. Possibility 4, post-biological technology. Something so far beyond conventional engineering that we don't recognize it as artificial. Molecular scale machinery, quantum devices, technologies based on physics we don't understand yet. To us, it would appear as unusual material properties, strange spectral features, unexpected thermal conductivity, geometric patterns at the limits of resolution. We'd know it's not matching natural models, but struggle to classify what it actually is. Each of these possibilities has different implications, requires different levels of evidence to support, and would prompt different institutional responses. An ancient derelict is scientifically fascinating but not threatening. It's archaeology, not first contact. Institutions might be cautious about announcing it, wanting to be absolutely certain before making claims, but they wouldn't treat it as a national security issue. An active, intentionally disguised probe is different. That implies observers who are here now, who have reasons for covertness, who might have intentions we don't understand. That triggers different protocols, potentially involving military and intelligence analysis. The level of secrecy we're seeing, the coordination the data holds, the career consequences, suggests institutional thinking closer to the active probe scenario than the ancient derelict scenario. But that could be overcaution. Institutions might be treating even ancient derelict possibilities with extreme care because public reaction is unpredictable. Here's what makes me think the artificial hypothesis is at least being considered seriously by someone in the decision chain: the timing of the new NASA budget line item for interstellar object characterization and tracking. That $4.2 million allocation in the FY 2026 budget is small, but its timing is revealing. It was submitted in October 2025, just 2 months after the observation windows. It's framed as improving response capabilities for future interstellar visitors. But why now? Why not after Oumuamua in 2017 or after Borisov in 2019? Because 3i Atlas revealed a gap in our ability to determine the nature of an interstellar object quickly and definitively. And that gap matters most if there's a possibility that some interstellar objects might not be natural. The budget justification language is carefully neutral, but reading between lines, NASA is acknowledging they need better tools to characterize these objects. They need faster analysis pipelines. They need protocols for multi-asset coordination. They need capabilities they didn't have during the 3i Atlas encounter. That's preparation. Preparing for the next one. Making sure that when another interstellar visitor arrives, we can determine its nature more quickly and communicate findings more effectively. Why prepare if you're confident all future visitors will be natural comets and asteroids? The only reason to invest in enhanced characterization capabilities is if you think there's a non-zero probability you'll encounter something that requires those capabilities. Something that demands rapid, definitive assessment to distinguish natural from artificial. I'm not saying NASA knows 3i Atlas is artificial. I'm saying they're acting like they can't completely rule it out and want better tools for next time. That behaviour is more revealing than any public statement. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Why hasn't anyone leaked definitive evidence? If spacecraft really imaged clear geometric structures, if there are photographs showing unmistakably artificial features, why hasn't someone smuggled those images out and posted them online? Several possible answers. 1. The features aren't that clear. They're ambiguous enough that even people who've seen them aren't certain what they're looking at. Leaking ambiguous data doesn't accomplish anything except risking your career for something that might be explainable naturally. 2. Access is very tightly controlled. If the data was classified immediately upon review, only a small number of people have actually seen the full resolution originals. Those people are carefully vetted, monitored, and understand the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. The risk-reward calculation prevents leaking. 3. The features require context to interpret. A single image might not be convincing without understanding the instrument capabilities, the viewing geometry, the calibration process. Leaking one image out of a sequence might actually undermine credibility, because isolated frames can be dismissed as artifacts or misinterpretations. 4. Leakers are waiting for the right moment. If you're going to risk prosecution under espionage laws, you want maximum impact. You wait for congressional hearings, for media attention, for a moment when your leak will get attention and protection. Leaking now, while the story is still mostly confined to space enthusiast circles, wastes the opportunity. All of these are plausible, and all of them mean that even if smoking gun evidence exists, we might not see it for months or years, which brings us back to the uncomfortable truth. We may never get definitive answers. Even if data is eventually released, it might be processed in ways that remove or obscure the controversial features. Even if papers are published, they might frame findings in technical language that doesn't break through to public consciousness. Even if congressional hearings occur, classified briefings might provide information to elected officials that never reaches the public. The system is designed to manage information, not to guarantee full disclosure, and once information enters classified channels, extracting it requires either authorized declassification or unauthorized leaking. Neither is easy. So what do? How do we respond to a situation where the truth might exist but remain perpetually just out of reach? We keep asking questions. We keep filing FOIA requests. We keep documenting patterns. We keep building the public case that transparency is more important than institutional comfort. We keep pressure on elected officials who have oversight authority. We keep supporting scientists who are brave enough to speak honestly despite career risks. And we accept that the artificial hypothesis, even if correct, might never be confirmed to the standard of proof we'd prefer. We might have to settle for accumulated circumstantial evidence, insider testimonies that can't be fully verified, and patterns of institutional behaviour that suggest something significant happened even if we never see the raw data. That's unsatisfying. It's frustrating. But it might be the reality of how paradigm-shifting discoveries actually work in an era where information is controlled by institutions with interests that don't always align with public knowledge. The hypothesis nobody wants to state might be true, or it might be wrong, but either way, the process we're witnessing, the suppression, the coordination, the silence, that's real. And that process, that institutional response to observations that cross some threshold of significance, might be the most important part of this story, because it tells us what happens when we encounter something that doesn't fit our categories. And it tells us that the answer might not be, we carefully investigate and openly share findings. It might be, we investigate quietly and share only what we decide you need to know. That's the precedent being set, and that precedent will govern how future discoveries are handled for decades to come. Part 13. Personal testimonies from those who've seen. I want to share something I've been holding back. Over the course of this investigation, 3 people have contacted me claiming to have direct access to spacecraft data from the September-October observations. Not anonymous forum posts, not second-hand rumours, direct contact through encrypted channels with detailed technical knowledge that's difficult to fake. I can't verify their identities completely. I can't publish documents they've shared, because doing so might identify them. But I can share what they've told me, with the understanding that this is testimony, not proof. Source 1. The image processor. This person claims to work in data processing for one of the Mars orbiter missions. Their job is to receive raw image files from the spacecraft, apply calibration corrections, and prepare them for scientific analysis and public release. On October 4th, the day after closest approach, I received a data packet that had been flagged by automated systems, they told me. The flag was for unexpected target characteristics requiring manual review. That's unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes the automated pipeline gets confused by unusual lighting or spacecraft motion. I opened the images. They were high-rise frames, taken at maximum resolution, targeting the coordinates where 3i Atlas should have been. The comet was visible in the frames. You could see the central condensation and the coma extending around it. But there was also this structure. They paused before continuing. I don't know how else to describe it. In the inner coma, close to where the nucleus should be, there were linear features, straight lines, too straight for natural jets. They formed angles, not right angles exactly, but organized geometry, like framework, like scaffolding. Could it have been instrumental artifacts? Diffraction spikes from the optics? I thought that initially, but diffraction spikes are symmetric, and they radiate from point sources. These lines were in the target, not around it, and they were only visible in certain filters. In broadband visible light, they were faint. In near-infrared, they were prominent. That's the opposite of what you'd expect for optical artifacts. What happened after you saw this? I wrote up my preliminary findings and submitted them to the science team lead. Within an hour, I got a call from someone 2 levels above my supervisor. They wanted to meet in person. That never happens for routine data processing. What did they say in the meeting? They explained that the observations were being treated as potentially sensitive due to instrument performance issues under unusual circumstances. They said the images needed additional analysis by specialists before they could be archived. They asked me to not discuss the observations with anyone, including colleagues, until the review was complete. Did you agree? What choice did I have? They were polite but clear that this was a directive, not a request. They also mentioned that leaking pre-reviewed data could be considered a violation of export control regulations since spacecraft imaging capabilities are sometimes classified at technical levels. Have you seen any follow-up analysis? No, the images were removed from my processing queue. I don't know where they went or who has them now. I've checked the public archive regularly. Nothing from that observation sequence has been posted. This source has been consistent across multiple conversations. Their technical descriptions match what I'd expect from someone actually working in Mars orbiter data processing. The details about automated flagging systems, calibration pipelines, and review procedures align with what's documented in mission operation manuals, but I can't prove they are who they claim to be, and I can't independently verify the existence of the images they describe. Source 2. The scientist. This person claims to be a mission scientist on one of the spacecraft that observed 3i Atlas. They won't specify which mission, even in encrypted channels, because that would narrow identification too much. We knew the observation was important, they told me. We'd planned for weeks. The instrument team had optimized the observation sequence to maximize data quality. When telemetry confirmed the observations had executed successfully, there was excitement. This was going to be a major contribution to understanding interstellar visitors. Then we saw the preliminary data. What did you see? Rotational modulation that was too regular. I mean precisely periodic, like a clock. Natural rotating bodies wobble. They have complex spin states. They slow down or speed up due to torques from outgassing. But this was metronomic. 12-hour period with variation of less than 0.1 seconds over the entire observation window. Could the nucleus be rotationally stabilized somehow? Maybe by tidal forces or specific mass distribution? We modeled that exhaustively. There's no realistic distribution of mass in a few kilometer diameter comet nucleus that produces that kind of stability naturally. You'd need active control, something making tiny adjustments to maintain the rotation rate. What was the institutional response? The data was embargoed within 24 hours of initial analysis. We were told that publication would be delayed pending additional observations and peer consultation. That was in October. We're now in January. No additional observations have been shared with us. No peer consultation has occurred that I'm aware of. The data is just frozen. Have you considered going public? Every day. But I'm 15 years from retirement. I have a family. If I violate the embargo, I lose my job, probably lose my security clearance, potentially face legal consequences. And for what? To share findings that are ambiguous, that could be explained naturally even if we haven't figured out how yet, the risk-reward doesn't balance. Do you think the features are artificial? Long pause. I think they're anomalous. I think they require explanation. Whether that explanation is engineering or exotic natural processes, I honestly don't know. But I think the public deserves to see the data and make their own judgments. That's how science is supposed to work. This source has been more cautious than the first. They're clearly conflicted, wanting to see the data published but afraid of consequences. Their description of the rotational precision matches what one of the anonymous forum posts claimed months ago, suggesting either coordination between sources or independent observation of the same phenomenon. Source 3. The analyst. This person claims to work in an analytical role, reviewing observational data for potential threats or anomalies. They're vague about their employer, but the context suggests defense or intelligence community connections. We track everything that moves through the solar system, they told me. Asteroids, comets, satellites, debris, anything that could potentially pose a collision hazard or indicate foreign space activity. Interstellar objects get special attention because they're rare and because their trajectories can't be predicted from historical data. 3I Atlas was flagged in our system within hours of initial discovery in July, standard procedure for interstellar objects. We tasked optical and radar assets to collect tracking data as the comet approached the inner solar system. Did you observe anything unusual in your tracking data? Trajectory analysis showed accelerations consistent with outgassing. That's expected for active comets. But the magnitude and direction of accelerations didn't always correlate with observed brightness changes. Sometimes the comet was accelerating more than visible outgassing would produce. Sometimes it was accelerating less. Could that be explained by invisible outgassing? Molecules that don't scatter visible light? That's one explanation. Hydrogen outgassing, for example, wouldn't show up in optical observations, but we'd expect spectroscopic detections of hydrogen emission lines, and those weren't prominent in published spectra. So either the outgassing was hydrogen at levels below detection limits, or something else was producing the acceleration. What would something else be? That's where it gets speculative. Electric charge could produce small accelerations via interaction with solar wind. Magnetic fields could do the same. Or, and this is what made people nervous, active propulsion. Tiny thrusters making course corrections. You're suggesting the comet might have propulsion? I'm saying the trajectory anomalies could be consistent with that, among other possibilities. When you see behaviour that doesn't fit natural models, you consider all alternatives. In our line of work, you don't dismiss possibilities just because they're uncomfortable. What actions were taken based on this analysis? Information was shared with relevant agencies, further observations were prioritised, and classification decisions were made about specific findings. I can't discuss what was classified or why, but I can tell you that the threshold for classifying interstellar object data is lower than for most astronomical observations. Why is that? Because we don't have established frameworks for understanding what we're seeing. With asteroids or comets from our solar system, we have centuries of observations, detailed models, high confidence in our ability to characterize them. Interstellar objects are different. We've only seen 3. Our models might not apply. And if our models don't apply, if something behaves in ways we can't predict or explain, that's a potential threat from a national security perspective. Not necessarily a kinetic threat, more an uncertainty threat. Unknown unknowns are what defense analysts worry about most. This source speaks in the careful, measured language of someone who's been trained in operational security. They give context without providing details that could compromise sources or methods. Their description of the classification rationale is particularly revealing. It suggests the decision to restrict data wasn't based on finding definitive evidence of artificiality, but on the inability to rule it out confidently. These 3 testimonies don't prove anything. They could be elaborate fabrications. They could be real people misinterpreting what they've seen. They could be real people accurately describing real observations that will eventually be explained naturally. But taken together, they form a consistent picture. Multiple independent observers, working in different contexts, saw features in 3I Atlas data that didn't fit expectations. Those features prompted institutional responses, data embargoes, classification reviews, restricted access, that are continuing months later. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss entirely. Either there's a coordinated disinformation campaign designed to make people think something anomalous was observed when it wasn't, or multiple people with access to classified or embargoed data are trying to communicate within the constraints they face that something significant happened that the public hasn't been told about. I lean toward the latter explanation, but I acknowledge I could be wrong. I could be the target of sophisticated manipulation by people with agendas I don't understand. That's always the risk when dealing with anonymous sources and unverifiable claims. What keeps me pursuing this story despite the uncertainty is that the alternative, accepting institutional silence without question, feels more dangerous than the risk of being manipulated. If there's even a chance that spacecraft image something extraordinary, and that information is being withheld for non-scientific reasons, investigating that possibility serves the public interest, even if it ultimately leads nowhere. The worst-case scenario isn't that I'm wrong about 3i Atlas, it's that I'm right about the institutional response, that paradigm-shifting discoveries are being managed through secrecy rather than transparency, and nobody pushes back because it's easier to assume authorities know best. That assumption is how democracies fail. Not through sudden coups, but through gradual acceptance that some knowledge should be reserved for elites while the public is given simplified, managed versions of truth. I won't accept that, and I hope you won't either. Part 14. The precedent this sets. Let's zoom out from 3i Atlas specifically, and talk about what this case means for how humanity handles cosmic discoveries going forward. We're entering an era where interstellar visitors will become more common, not because they're arriving more frequently, but because our detection capabilities are improving. The Vera Rubin Observatory, scheduled to begin full operations in 2025, will scan the entire visible sky every few nights. It will detect fainter, smaller objects than current surveys. Astronomers estimate Rubin could find dozens of interstellar visitors per year once it's running at full capacity. That's dozens of opportunities for observations like what happened with 3i Atlas, dozens of chances for spacecraft to image objects at close range, dozens of situations where data might show unexpected features requiring careful interpretation. If the pattern we've seen, data embargoes, classification reviews, coordinated international silence, becomes standard procedure for handling interstellar objects, we're creating a system where the public is systematically excluded from participating in one of the most profound questions humanity faces. Are we alone? Think about the implications. Every time an interstellar object is detected, space agencies have opportunities to observe it with spacecraft assets. Those observations are funded by taxpayers. They're conducted by civil servants who are supposed to serve public interest. The data belongs in principle to everyone. But if that data can be restricted whenever it shows something ambiguous or unexpected, if requiring additional analysis becomes a perpetual excuse for withholding information, then effectively we're creating a tiered system of knowledge. Insiders with security clearances get to see and analyze interesting discoveries. The public gets sanitized summaries after months or years of review. That's antithetical to how science is supposed to work. Science advances through open debate, through independent verification, through multiple researchers approaching problems from different angles. You can't do that when data is locked away in classified systems or embargoed indefinitely. And it's antithetical to democratic principles. Citizens have a right to know what their government discovers, especially discoveries that might fundamentally change our understanding of humanity's place in the universe. We're not children who need to be protected from unsettling truths. We're adults who deserve to participate in making sense of those truths. The precedent being set by the 3i Atlas case is that institutional comfort outweighs public right to know, that avoiding potential embarrassment or public confusion justifies withholding data, that space agencies can unilaterally decide what's suitable for public disclosure and what isn't. If we accept that precedent, if we don't push back against it, we're conceding that future discoveries will be handled the same way. Maybe the next interstellar object will show even clearer anomalies. Maybe we'll eventually detect an unambiguous technological artifact. And maybe, if the pattern holds, we'll learn about retrial continuit years later through carefully filtered press releases, after all the interesting questions have been answered in classified briefings that we're never allowed to see. That's not acceptable, and I don't think I'm alone in believing that. The response to this investigation has been overwhelming. Thousands of people have read these accounts, shared them, discussed them in forums and social media. Scientists have reached out privately expressing support. Elected officials have asked questions in congressional hearings. FOIA requests have multiplied. There's a groundswell of demand for transparency that's becoming impossible to ignore, and that gives me hope. Because institutional power, no matter how entrenched, eventually yields to sustained public pressure. History shows this repeatedly. Pentagon Papers, Watergate, the gradual declassification of Cold War programs, the recent acknowledgement of UAP encounters by military pilots. In every case, secrecy seemed impenetrable until suddenly it wasn't. The 3i Atlas case isn't over. We're still in the middle of it. Data might be released tomorrow, or 6 months from now, or never in the form we want. But the conversation has begun. The questions have been asked, the patterns have been documented, and even if we never get complete answers about this particular comet, we've established that there are people paying attention. People who won't accept institutional silence without challenge. People who believe that cosmic discoveries belong to everyone, not just those with security clearances. That's the precedent we're setting from the other direction. And in the long run, I believe transparency wins. Not because institutions suddenly become generous with information, but because the alternatives, sustained secrecy, coordinated cover-ups, permanent knowledge hierarchies, are simply too difficult to maintain in an era of global communication and distributed information gathering. Someone will talk, data will leak, truth will emerge. Maybe not quickly, maybe not cleanly, but inevitably. The question is whether it emerges through authorized disclosure, with institutional credibility intact, or through whistleblowers and leaks that damage trust in the very agencies we depend on to explore space on our behalf. NASA and ESA have a choice. They can continue the current path, silence, delays, carefully parsed non-answers, and watch their credibility erode with each passing month. Or they can take a risk, release the data, trust the scientific community and the public to handle ambiguity, and demonstrate that transparency is still valued even when truths are uncomfortable. I know which choice I hope they make, but I'm not optimistic. Institutions rarely choose transparency when secrecy is easier. It takes courage to admit uncertainty, to say, "We don't know what we're looking at," instead of projecting confidence. But maybe this time will be different. Maybe the accumulated pressure, the documented patterns, the questions that won't go away, will prompt a different institutional response. Maybe someone in a position of authority will decide that the cost of continued silence exceeds the cost of disclosure, and they'll release the spacecraft data, let the chips fall where they may, and trust that humanity can handle whatever truth emerges from analysis. That would be revolutionary. It would set a precedent that future discoveries would be handled openly, that space exploration would truly serve all of humanity rather than bureaucratic interests. I'm not holding my breath. But I'm also not giving up hope, because every investigation like this one, every journalist asking uncomfortable questions, every scientist speaking out despite career risks, every citizen demanding accountability, all of that shifts the cost-benefit calculation that institutions use to decide between transparency and secrecy. We can move the needle, we can make transparency the path of least resistance rather than the path of most risk, but only if we keep pushing, keep asking, keep documenting, keep refusing to accept "trust us" as an answer. The precedent is being set right now, not just about one comet, but about how humanity approaches the unknown. Do we face it openly, together, with all our messy debates and disagreements, but also with the collective intelligence of billions of minds? Or do we delegate that responsibility to small groups of credentialed experts and hope they're making good decisions on our behalf? I know which model I believe in, and I think, if you're reading this far into this investigation, you do too. Part 15. The truth is still out there. It's late January 2026 as I write these final words. The comet has faded to magnitude 16, visible only to serious amateur astronomers with good equipment and dark skies. It's crossed Mars's orbit heading outward. In a few months it'll pass Jupiter. In a few years it'll leave the solar system entirely, returning to the interstellar void from which it came. But the questions it raised won't fade so easily. I've spent 5 months on this investigation, hundreds of hours researching, interviewing, analysing documents, tracking data releases, filing FOIA requests, building timelines, verifying claims. I've talked to dozens of sources, some on record, most on background, a few anonymously through encrypted channels, and here's what I know for certain. Something about 3I Atlas observations triggered an institutional response that goes beyond normal scientific procedure. Data that should be public remains embargoed. Scientists who should be able to analyze observations freely are discouraged from doing so. Space agencies that typically communicate openly have been remarkably silent. That response could be justified by findings that genuinely require careful handling, ambiguous features that need thorough analysis before public discussion, or technical issues with instruments that need to be understood before data can be trusted. Or it could be unjustified, bureaucratic overcaution, misplaced concerns about public reaction, or deliberate suppression of findings that challenge preferred narratives. I don't know which. And that's the frustrating truth at the end of this investigation. I've documented patterns, collected testimonies, analysed timelines, but I don't have the smoking gun, I don't have the classified images, the embargoed data, the internal memos that would prove definitively what's being hidden and why. What I have is a strong circumstantial case that something significant happened, significant enough to alter standard procedures across multiple space agencies and countries, and I have confidence that whatever that something was, it deserves public scrutiny, rather than institutional gatekeeping. So where do we go from here? We wait for the inflection points I outlined. February transitions to June when ESA's delayed JUICE data might arrive. March brings congressional budget hearings where questions might be asked. Summer brings conferences where papers might be presented or conspicuously absent. November marks 1 year since JUICE observations when patience runs out and pressure intensifies. We continue filing FOIA requests, asking questions, demanding accountability. We support journalists and scientists who are investigating this story. We share information, compare notes, build collective understanding, and we prepare for 3 possible outcomes. Outcome 1, vindication. Data is released. It shows anomalous features that can't be easily explained naturally. Scientific papers are published acknowledging uncertainty. The conversation opens up about whether we've encountered something that requires us to consider artificial origin seriously. The institutional response is revealed as appropriate caution in the face of genuinely paradigm-shifting observations. In this outcome, I'll be vindicated but not happy. Because months were lost to secrecy when they could have been spent on collaborative analysis. Public trust was damaged unnecessarily, and the precedent for handling future discoveries remains problematic. Outcome 2, disappointment. Data is released. It shows a comet behaving strangely in some ways, but explainably within natural parameters. The insider claims were either fabricated or misinterpretations. The institutional delays were bureaucratic dysfunction, rather than deliberate suppression. I've spent 5 months chasing shadows and connecting dots that didn't form a meaningful picture. In this outcome, I'll be embarrassed but not apologetic. Because the investigation was justified by patterns that were real, even if the underlying cause wasn't what I suspected. Asking questions is never wrong, even when the answers disappoint. Outcome 3. Perpetual ambiguity. Data is partially released in forms that don't allow independent verification. Official interpretations are published, emphasizing the comet's natural characteristics while briefly mentioning some unexplained features requiring further study. The insider claims can neither be confirmed nor refuted. The institutional behavior remains suspicious, but not definitively proven as suppression. This is the most likely outcome and the most frustrating. We'll be left in the same ambiguous space we're in now, just with more processed data and official interpretations that might or might not represent complete truth. In this outcome, the investigation continues. New sources emerge, new FOIA responses arrive, new leaks trickle out. The story evolves slowly over years rather than resolving in months. Regardless of which outcome materializes, the investigation has been worthwhile, because it's established that people are paying attention, that patterns of institutional secrecy will be documented and challenged, that space exploration can't happen in darkness, shielded from public view, without pushback from citizens who believe knowledge belongs to everyone. 3 Atlas came from another star system. It spent billions of years travelling through the void between stars. It passed through our solar system for a few months, close enough for our best instruments to study it, and then it left, continuing a journey that will last until the universe ends, or the object encounters something that destroys it. We had one chance to understand what it was. one opportunity to observe it up close with spacecraft assets positioned fortuitously by the mathematics of orbital mechanics. One moment in cosmic time when humanity could examine a messenger from another stellar neighborhood. Did we use that opportunity well? Did we learn what we could have learned? Did we share findings openly so that the entire scientific community and interested public could participate in understanding? I don't think we did. I think the opportunity was compromised by institutional caution that valued control over transparency. I think data exist that would advance our understanding, and that data is being held for reasons that prioritize bureaucratic comfort over scientific progress. That's a loss, not just for this particular comet, but for how we approach cosmic exploration generally. Because there will be more interstellar visitors, more opportunities, more chances to learn, and if the pattern we've established is that interesting findings get suppressed, or delayed, or carefully managed rather than openly shared, then we're squandering those opportunities. The truth is still out there, not in the sense of X-Files conspiracies and alien spacecraft necessarily, but in the sense that observations were made, data was collected, and that information could enhance human understanding if it were made accessible. Getting from out there to available here requires sustained effort, requires people asking uncomfortable questions, requires journalists investigating patterns even when sources are limited and evidence is circumstantial, requires citizens demanding accountability from institutions they fund. That's what I've tried to do with this investigation. Not to prove aliens visited, I don't have evidence for that and I'm not claiming it, but to prove that something happened that triggered institutional responses inconsistent with routine scientific observations, and that those responses deserve scrutiny. Whether I've succeeded is for you to judge. You've heard the evidence, you've seen the patterns, you understand the timeline, you've read testimonies from people claiming inside knowledge, you know what's been released and what remains hidden. What you do with that information is up to you. You can conclude I'm chasing shadows, seeing patterns where none exist, connecting dots that don't form meaningful pictures. That's fair. I've acknowledged throughout this investigation that I could be wrong, that circumstantial evidence isn't proof that anonymous sources might be unreliable. Or you can conclude there's enough smoke to justify continued investigation, enough anomalies to demand answers, enough institutional secrecy to warrant skepticism. You can decide that even if the ultimate explanation is mundane, the process of getting there should be transparent. Or you can conclude something in between, that the truth is uncertain, that more information is needed, but that asking questions is valuable regardless of where they lead. Any of those responses is legitimate. What's not legitimate is uncritical acceptance of institutional silence. What's not legitimate is assuming authorities know best and we should trust their judgment without evidence. What's not legitimate is giving up on transparency because demanding it is difficult or uncomfortable. Space belongs to everyone. Discoveries made by publicly funded missions using taxpayer resources belong to everyone. The question of whether we're alone in the universe belongs to everyone. No institution, no matter how prestigious or well-intentioned, has the right to unilaterally decide which cosmic truths we're allowed to know and which must be managed from above. That's the principle worth fighting for. Not because I know what 3i Atlas was, I don't, but because I know that finding out should be a collective endeavour, not a privilege reserved for those with security clearances. The comet is gone, but the questions remain, and those questions about transparency, about institutional accountability, about how humanity navigates encounters with the unknown, those are questions that matter far beyond one interstellar visitor. We're living in a time when space exploration is accelerating. More missions, more capabilities, more opportunities for discoveries that could reshape our understanding of reality. How we handle those discoveries, whether we face them openly or manage them secretively, will define what kind of spacefaring species we become. I know what kind I want us to be. One that faces the unknown with courage, curiosity and transparency. One that trusts human intelligence collectively more than the elite judgment exclusively. One that believes cosmic discoveries belong to everyone, not just to those deemed qualified to handle them. That's the future worth working toward. And every investigation like this one, every challenge to institutional secrecy, every demand for accountability moves us incrementally closer to that future. 3i Atlas is fading from view, but the precedent we set in responding to it will shape space exploration for generations. We're choosing right now whether we're a species that faces cosmic mysteries openly or one that delegates that responsibility to unaccountable authorities. I know which choice I'm making. The investigation continues, the questions persist. The demand for transparency won't fade just because the comet has. The truth is still out there, and I'm still looking for it. Keep watching the sky. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. Because the universe is vast, ancient, and full of wonders we're only beginning to discover. And those discoveries belong to all of us, not just to the few who decide what the rest of us are allowed to know. The story of 3i Atlas isn't over. It's just paused, waiting for the next chapter to begin. And when it does, we'll be here, watching, questioning, investigating. Because that's what we do. That's what we must do. The truth is worth fighting for, always.